Chapter 5. Imagery and Symbolism. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Of all the critical terms you'll ever come across, imagery is subject to more abuse and confusion than any other. The root word, image, from the Latin imago, has a bewildering array of associated meanings. Picture, copy, imitation, ghost, idea, shadow, appearance, similarity. When a word can suggest exactness on the one hand and distortion on the other, there's bound to be trouble. So, as a critical writer, you need to be especially clear in using the term. Because symbolism depends on an understanding of imagery, we'll discuss symbolism later in the chapter. Imagery is an umbrella term that includes similes, metaphors, and other forms of figurative language. But in its larger, more complete meaning, imagery refers to all references to the senses in a literary work, not just the senses that appear in similes and metaphors. We'll discuss similes, metaphors, and other special uses of imagistic language in the next section of the chapter. Now, however, let's look at how literature makes connections with the five senses: sight, taste, touch, smell, and hearing, as well as a sixth, kinesthesia, a sense of physical tension and relaxation in the muscles and joints. There are several questions to answer when critically assessing how imagery evokes the senses. Which senses are used? Sight is the most predominant sense in literary imagery. Even when other senses are represented in a work, sight still tends to be the major sense, and it is unusual to find a work that makes few or no specific references to sight. We've purposely included one of these unusual works, Nemirov's The Vacuum, in the appendix. Notice how hearing becomes the predominant sense as the poem is framed by references to what the speaker hears. The first line says how quiet the house is after, as we learn later, the speaker's wife has died. The last two lines recreate the human-like howling of the vacuum cleaner after it has been compared to the wife's lingering spirit. When other senses compete with, or even suppress, the sense of sight, there is usually a reason. In the context of Nemirov's poem, it would be quite natural for the absence of sound to be highlighted in a home where a loved one had recently died. Nemirov works this heightened sense into his poem by showing how the speaker's imagination projects his wife's soul into the silent vacuum cleaner. Normally, though, sight will be the most pervasive sense in literary imagery. It can help your critical analysis of imagery to note both the types of senses and the frequency of their appearance in a work. You can then connect these observations with how the presence or absence of imagery affects the reader and serves the author's purposes. How clear are the senses? The sharpness or vagueness in which sentences are presented has a direct bearing on the effects an author creates. For example, the bright colors of New Flowers in Williams' The Widow's Lament in Springtime shows how visually aware the speaker is. Masses of flowers load the cherry branches and color some bushes yellow and some red. The intensity of even this sight is reduced by the widow's emotional state expressed in the next lines. But the grief in my heart is stronger than they, for though they were my joy formerly, today I noticed them and turned away, forgetting. These lines illustrate the importance of seeing imagery in the context of the whole work and not just as isolated references to senses. The isolated image is the vivid colors of the flowers. The image takes on the thematic meaning when the pleasure it originally created for the widow is contrasted with her present grief. Senses may also be presented vaguely, without sharp detail and contrast. In Porter's The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, we see the present and past filtering through Granny's failing senses. Granny reflects. "Plenty of girls get jilted. You were jilted, weren't you? Then stand up to it." Her eyelids wavered and let in streamers of blue-gray light like tissue paper over her eyes. She must get up and pull the shade down, or she'd never sleep. Better turn over, hide from the light. Sleeping in the light gives you nightmares. Cornelia's voice staggered and bumped like a cart in a bad road. It rounded corners and turned back again and arrived nowhere. Porter uses the image of tissue to suggest that Granny's sight is blurring. The image of the bumping cart is used to describe Cornelia's voice as it comes unevenly to Granny's ears. Remember, an author's imagery conveys just as much sensory information as he or she feels the reader needs. Two terms that describe the relative presence or absence of imagery in a work are concrete and abstract. A concrete work is dense with sensory information, while an abstract work is relatively free of imagery, exclusively developed with ideas and concepts. Like the thematic terms impressionistic and didactic, which we discussed in Chapter 3, concrete and abstract suggest a range rather than a fixed quantity of imagery. A poem such as Pound's In a Station of the Metro is considered highly concrete, while Herrick's To the Virgins is fairly concrete in the first two stanzas but abstract in the last two. While authors may not always be right in deciding how much and what kind of imagery is needed, we can't fault an author of a work simply because there is very little or a great deal of imagery. What the critical writer needs to decide is whether the imagery is appropriate to the work and how it affects the reader's experience. What is the focus of the imagery? Beyond choosing particular senses and how sharply to present them, an author may fit images together to create a dominant impression. Images often cluster around a single idea or feeling. For example, the images in The Widow's Lament in Springtime recreate pictures of nature in spring. In contrast, the images in Robinson's The Mill are not focused. There are both domestic images and images of nature in the poem. The imagery in Shakespeare's That Time of Year focuses on things that are ending or dying. The end of autumn and a tree's yearly bloom. The end of a day, the end of a fire. After identifying the images, you should then look for a pattern, a category or class in which some or all of the images fit. Then, see if you can discover why the author has chosen this particular pattern of images. Critical writing about imagery is not simply a matter of hunting for and identifying images in a literary work. What we want to know about imagery is how it operates, how it determines the character of a work, how it reinforces or conflicts with theme, in short, how it affects the reader. Compare the following paragraphs on imagery in Robinson's The Mill. A. The imagery in the first stanza presents a domestic scene. The miller's wife is waiting at home. There is cold tea and a dead fire, and she remembers how her husband did not seem to want to go out the door. In the second stanza, she goes to the mill, her husband's place of work, where the warm smell of the grain strikes her, and she sees her husband hanging from a beam. In the last stanza, the poet uses images of nature, the black smooth water compared to the night sky, as the miller's wife contemplates suicide. B. The poem's imagery contributes to feelings of fear, despair, and the end of life. The life has gone out of the home of the miller and his wife, reflected in the cold tea and dead fire, giving the reader a sense of loneliness. The only warmth in the poem is associated with the mealy fragrance of the past in the mill, a place where the miller probably used to find meaning in life, but no longer. His last words are, "There are no millers anymore." The image of her husband hanging from the beam seems to haunt and follow the miller's wife, as she has nothing to live for. The poem's final image is of the place she chooses for her own suicide, a black swampy pond to cover up her desperate act. This place creates a feeling even more lifeless and cold than the spiritless home both she and her husband have left forever. Notice how the writer of paragraph A is content to rattle off the key pictures in the poem in a kind of imagistic paraphrase, as if merely to prove he or she could spot them. In paragraph B, though, the writer shows a sensitivity to the overall effects of the imagery, not only on the wife, but on the reader as well. Imagery isn't just tacked on to be picked out, but rather it's an integral part of the characters, the storyline, the theme, the whole work. This is what you should aim at in the writing about imagery. Figurative language. If imagery in its larger sense calls our attention to the physical sensations represented in a literary work, then figurative language is the special use of imagery that makes us see connections between things that are familiar and unfamiliar. The diagram shows the relationship between imagery and figurative language. Connections between the familiar and the unfamiliar. Despite the complexities of figurative language, there is a central idea that will help you thread your way through, namely that connections between the familiar and the unfamiliar usually involve the senses. It may help to get at the nature of figurative language to recall the story of how one of the most famous books of poetry, Lyrical Ballad, 1798, came to be written. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, two young poets in the late 18th century England, found that they shared the same ideas about poetry. Like many artists, they wanted to do something new, so they agreed to write and publish a series of poems that would draw on their individual skills and interests. As Coleridge describes their separate tasks for the book, he actually reveals the two basic components of figurative language. familiarity and unfamiliarity. It was agreed that my endeavors should be directed to things supernatural, so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to give the charm of novelty to things every day, which, in consequence of familiarity, we have eyes yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. In short, Coleridge was to make the unfamiliar familiar, and Wordsworth was to make the familiar fresh and new. This is what figurative language does, or tries to do. It enables us to see in new ways things we thought we knew before, as well as things we've never imagined. Figurative language may not always work, and you may get tied up in illogical, tired, or dead metaphors, but making connections between dissimilar things, ideas, feelings, and objects is how we learn. Poets, playwrights, and fiction writers take the method to its most developed possibilities. Let's look at the most common forms of figurative language. Figures of speech have two parts, one thing being compared to another. The critic I.A. Richards developed two very useful terms to describe these parts: tenor and vehicle. The tenor is the main subject or focus of attention. The vehicle is the image that carries or expands our view of the tenor. For example, in the comparison, like as the waves make toward the pebble shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Shakespeare's primary subject, the tenor, is the progress of life towards death. The vehicle with which he develops his subject and holds our interest is the image of waves, one after another, rolling toward a beach. Simile. A simile is a comparison in which the connection between the tenor and vehicle is made quite obvious with one of four connecting words: like, as, appear, and seem. The comparison in a simile might be quite logical and believable, or it might be quite illogical and bizarre. The image of the snake in Lawrence's Snake is developed through the poem with similes, underlined. He lifted his head from his drinking, as cattle do, and looked at me vaguely, as drinking cattle do, and lifted his head dreamily, as one who is drunken, and looked around like a god, unseeing into the air, for he seemed to me again like a king in exile, uncrowned in the underworld, now due to be crowned again. As we've said before, it's not enough to just be able to identify similes. You need to account for them and their effects in a work, and this means connecting them with theme. Lawrence is showing a person, the speaker, confused about the tradition surrounding snakes. The similes show new and unexpected dimensions of the reptile, a gentle cow, a proud god, an exiled king. The similes help us see the snake differently by expanding and even jolting our usual expectations. They may also recall the Christian tradition of the snake as Satan, the fallen angel who rebelled against God, and show Lawrence exploring the possibility of something good and noble in the image traditionally associated with evil. Occasionally, a simile may be developed at some length in several stanzas of poetry or paragraphs of prose. Such extended similes can be quite intricate and carry a great amount of compressed meaning. One of the most famous extended similes is from John Donne's A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, where the speaker tells his lover that their love can endure a separation because their souls are like two parts of a compass joined at the top. Love is the tenor, a compass the vehicle. The extended simile is introduced by a shorter one, comparing the separation to gold beaten thin by a goldsmith. We've underlined the tenor and the vehicle and boxed the connecting word in the simile. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth, if the others do. And though it is in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans, and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. As you develop your critical sensibility, it's important not to associate imagery and figurative language merely with poetry. Fiction, non-fiction, and drama may also draw on the senses and figurative comparisons, though perhaps not with as much frequency as poetry. In the following section from Cheever's The Country Husband, two similes are used to convey Francis Weed's state of awareness the morning after he realizes he's infatuated with Anne Murchison, the babysitter. It was a clear morning. The morning seemed thrown like a gleaming bridge of light over his mixed affairs. His spirits were feverish and high. The image of the girl seemed to put him into a relationship with the world that was mysterious and enthralling. An express train, a night train from Buffalo or Albany, came down the tracks. Then he saw an extraordinary thing. At one of the bedroom windows sat an unclothed woman of exceptional beauty, combing her golden hair. She passed like an apparition through Shady Hill, combing and combing her hair. Even if The Country Husband is the only Cheever story you've read, you probably realize that he does not often use figurative language, making these two instances particularly notable. In terms of the story, there is good reason for their appearance at this point. Francis's life, until his attraction to Anne, has been impoverished of imagination and passion. Now with his emotion rekindled, two similes close to one another are appropriate complements to his provoked imagination, meshing nicely with Cheever's theme that life in modern suburbia can ironically blend the dull and commonplace with that which is rich and visionary. Metaphor. Similes make quite explicit comparisons that ultimately keep the tenor and vehicle intact and separate. Metaphors make stronger comparisons that often merge the tenor and vehicle. If similes say A is like B, metaphors imply that A is B. His words came forth like a rushing torrent is a simile. His words were a rushing torrent is a metaphor. Metaphoric comparisons, though, can't be reduced to a simple formula, such as A, tenor, is B, vehicle. The formula won't help us with something like the air surged and rolled on with his words. Image-bearing words, the vehicle, are not always connected to the tenor with is or a form of the verb to be. The tenor and vehicle in a metaphor can be woven together in at least three distinct ways. 1. Tenor plus form of verb to be plus vehicle. Example, a shark is an eating machine. This is the way that metaphors are usually described, and many readers never get beyond looking just for this kind, when actually it is the least common. In the example above, shark is the tenor and eating machine is the vehicle. Tenor and vehicle are connected by is. Here are several other examples with T indicating the tenor and V indicating the vehicle. Here, where men sit and hear each other groan, where but to think is to be full of sorrow. John Keats. This is a rare example of a metaphor where both parts are non-imagistic, that is, essentially abstract and without references to the senses. I was the prince of the apple towns. I was green. Sorrow is my own yard. Granny lay curled down within herself, amazed and watchful, staring at the point of light that was herself. Her body was now only a deeper mass of shadow in an endless darkness. One note of caution, not every sentence with a form of the verb to be in it is a metaphor. The primary linking verb to be gets quite a workout in most languages by connecting subjects and objects and by expanding meaning, as in Shakespeare is a late Renaissance poet, or reduced supply is the greatest cause of inflation. It is only when two unlike things are connected that we have a metaphor. 2. Tenor plus descriptive words, but vehicle not mentioned. Example, the shark eats with mechanical precision. This is the most common form of metaphor, as words surrounding the tenor carry the image and make the connection with an unstated vehicle. Shark is again the tenor, as in the above example. A machine is the unstated vehicle, expressed by the vehicle words, mechanical precision. The vehicle words, VW, may be nouns other than the vehicle itself, verbs, adjectives, or adverbs, as in the following. Farewell, love, and all thy laws forever, thy baited hook shall tangle me no more. Here we have the interesting situation of two sets of tenor vehicle words and implied vehicle. The implied vehicles are a fisherman and a fish. How dull is it to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, unpolished, not to shine in use? The unstated vehicle is something made of metal, rusting from disuse. 3. Vehicle plus descriptive words, but tenor not mentioned at all or long before. Example, the eating machine sliced through the man's leg with precision. This is not as common as the second form of metaphor, but when it occurs, it creates a unique and enriching effect. The connection between unstated tenor and stated vehicle depends on the context, what has come before in the work, so that the tenor is echoed without being specifically identified. In the above example, the unstated tenor is a shark and is conveyed by the vehicle eating machine, and the descriptive words sliced and mechanical precision. Two special types of this metaphoric forms are metonymy and synecdoche. Metonymy is the use of something associated with the tenor to stand for the tenor, as in 10,000 spears marched into battle. The vehicle, spears, represents the unstated tenor, soldiers. Synecdoche is the form of metaphor in which a part is used as the vehicle for the unstated whole, tenor as in his heart was sorrowful. The vehicle is heart, and the unstated tenor is a man. Here are several examples. Beat, beat, drums, blow, bugles, blow. Through the windows, through the doors, burst like a ruthless force into the solemn church, and scatter the congregation. The unstated tenor is war. Those parts of thee that the world's eye doth view want nothing that the thought of hearts can mend. All tongues, the voice of souls, give thee that due. Here are three synecdoches standing for those people who will see the speaker's love and praise his or her attractiveness. As we've seen, figurative connections can be made in a variety of ways, with both tenor and vehicle present or with one or the other absent. In critical writing, depending on your purpose and the assignment, you may want to look closely at the construction of individual metaphors and similes, or at the patterns of images set up in a work. For example, after reading Carl Shapiro's Arto Rec, you could approach the poem's figurative language first by listing the poem's major imagistic comparisons, then labeling what kind they are, simile or one of the three types of metaphor, and finally using the thought pattern of classification. Try to group the images into some pattern with a common theme. After each of the key images that follow are line numbers for easy reference to the poem and a classification into type. Its quick soft silver bell beating, beating. Metaphor type 2. The ambulance bell, tenor, is compared with a heart, unstated vehicle, by the vehicle words, beating, beating, recreating the sense of sound. And down the dark one, ruby flare, pulsing out red like an artery. Similarly, using sight, touch, and kinesthesia, this figurative image compares the flare, tenor, with a pulsing artery, vehicle. Our throats were tight as tourniquets. Similarly, the condition of the speaker's throats, tenor, is compared with the kinesthetic feeling of tight bandages to stop the flow of blood, vehicle. Our feet were bound with splints. Metaphor type 3. In this image, the presence of a form of the verb to be does not signal the first type of metaphor. The horror of witnessing the accident, unstated tenor, is conveyed by the image of bound feet, vehicle. Like convalescence, intimate and gauche, we speak through sickly smiles. Similarly, the speaker witnesses, tenor, are compared with patients who are recovering and who have developed a shared closeness, vehicle. But we remain, touching a wound that opens to our richest horror. Metaphor type 3. The lasting impression of and the philosophical questions raised by the accident, unstated tenor, are compared with patients' curiosity about their wounds, which, upon probing, start bleeding again, vehicle. And cancer, simple as a flower, blooms. Similarly, cancer, tenor, is compared with the blooming flower, vehicle, an ironically positive image, but physically accurate, because when cancer cells are seen with a microscope, they do seem to bloom. The image serves the question, how can something so beautiful in itself be so deadly? This creates a deeper metaphor, type 3, in which the unstated tenor is fascination with accidental death. The accident cancels our physics with a sneer. Metaphor type 2. The accident, tenor, is expressed by the word this in the preceding line. The vehicle word, cancel, and sneer suggest some person or being with the power to destroy the principles of rational life, physics. This person or being's power is the unstated vehicle, which is being compared with the effect of the accident. In looking for patterns of thematic threads running throughout these figurative images, we can say that physical accident and disease predominate as vehicles, with the effect of the accident on the speaker being the consistent tenor. The critical writer needs skill in looking closely at individual images to understand how they work and how they affect the reader, as well as in looking at all the images in a work to discern patterns that develop themes. Your critical essay will not include a detailed analysis of every image, such as we just completed. That activity is part of pre-writing about imagery. The final drafts would probably be more concerned with image patterns, your observations being supported with specific representative illustrations of how individual images work. Personification. From the most primitive to the most civilized person, we have a tendency to see human life everywhere in the world. We people the objects and forces of nature with spirits, beings, intentions, both beneficial and hostile to human beings, and we build a universe in reference to ourselves. What anthropologists call anthropomorphism, seeing everything in terms of human form, literary critics call personification, or seeing what is non-human as having human qualities. A variation on this way of seeing is animation, that is, giving lifelike qualities, not necessarily human, to something that is lifeless. Personification in animation can be expressed in both similes and metaphors. Here are some examples. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his overtaking wings and chased us south along. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Notice how Coleridge has embedded in the personification of the storm as an overpowering man the metaphoric comparison with a bird of prey. Death's second self, sleep that seals up all in rest. Shakespeare. When the green woods laugh with the voice of joy, and the dimpling stream runs laughing by, come live and be merry. William Blake. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Emily Dickinson. The city of London never felt a calm so deep. The river gildeth at its own sweet will, dear God. The very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. William Wordsworth. Symbolism. The word symbol can be just as confusing and overfull of meaning as the word image. The Latin and Greek roots for symbol mean token or sign, something that stands for something else. One good way of understanding symbolism is to think metaphorically of resonance, the repetition and expansion of sound. When we hear a cello playing in a small room, the sound is pleasant enough, but when 15 cellos joined by a full symphony orchestra play in a large concert hall, the sound resonates throughout. This is something like what a symbol does. It takes something isolated, having a literal meaning in itself, and through tradition and long cultural use, make it resonate with layers of associated meaning. Consider the associations connected with the following visual symbols. The complexity and power of the symbols can be seen if you consider what these two figures mean for each of the groups they represent. Figure 1, the swastika, is best known as the official emblem of the Nazi Party in Germany before, during, and after World War II. For the Nazis, it stood for a rising sense of pride after the humiliation Germany suffered after World War I, the superiority of those with pure German European ethnic backgrounds, and the strength of the German military. For those countries and groups opposed to Germany during World War II, the swastika became a hated symbol for the madness that drove Hitler to try to conquer the world and eradicate minorities, especially Jews. Ironically, this figure among ancient Orientals and American Indians was a good luck symbol. Figure 2, the Star of David, represents the religion of Judaism, the nation of Israel, and the cultural heritage of all Jews. The resonating layers of association include the pride with which Jews see themselves, the historical experience of losing a sacred homeland, and then regaining and defending it in the 20th century, the religious truth of the sacred texts of the Torah, and the obligations of practicing faith and hope in everyday life. Symbols, then, are specific devices which stand for and focus the shared meanings of groups. Now look at the photograph below. Here we have a number of visual images which operate as symbols on the viewers, all suggesting age and the passing of time. The looming clock tower, the person stooped over using a cane and facing, perhaps contemplating, the great edifice of time, and the ornate roofs and towers of buildings from another age. The photo doesn't specifically point to the values or meanings to be associated with these time symbols, so in this case, the viewer has to supply them. On the one hand, we might see the arrangement of symbols as negative, man surrounded, dominated, or even intimidated by time with no hope of outliving these cultural monuments. On the other hand, we might see the presentation of these symbols as positive. The human figure in perspective is just as tall as the clock tower, and from the photographic angle towers above the nearby rooftops and lesser towers, perhaps suggesting that man has a stature and grandeur equal to time. Specific knowledge or information can sometimes fill out our interpretation of symbols. In the photo, for example, how does your interpretation change if you're told that the clock tower is the famous Big Ben looming up from Parliament, the seat of the British government in London, and, moreover, that the human figure is actually a statue of Winston Churchill, the great statesman? A symbol is a natural or man-made object or a human experience that specifically stands for a concept or a set of values or beliefs. For example, the vacuum cleaner in Nemirov's The Vacuum stands for not only the spirit of the speaker's dead wife, but also the emptiness in his house and life. In discussing symbols, we use such verbs as stands for, represents, symbolizes, and is to show the direct relationship between the object, experience, and the meaning. In modern literature, pure symbols are relatively rare, and what we find more frequently are symbolic associations. When the object or experience implies rather than stands for a concept or set of values, we have symbolic associations. The most common symbolic associations in literature have to do with time of day and the seasonal cycle. We've all internalized the symbolic connections with times of day and the seasons so well that they sound almost too trite to mention. We associate the setting sun, the west, night, and darkness with fear, melancholy, and death. The east, the light of dawn, and the rising sun have come to mean birth, hope, new beginnings, and happiness. Likewise, with the seasons. Spring suggests new life, rebirth, youth, love, regeneration, and fertility. Summer, the prime of life and growth. Autumn, sadness, and the approach of death, the final harvest. And winter, the cessation of life, impending darkness and despair. Of course, experience shows these associations to have their exceptions, but the experiences of generations over the centuries have fixed these connections in our lives so that they evoke fairly consistent shared meanings when used in literary works. To discuss symbolic associations critically, we use verbs as suggests, implies, and connotes. While symbols and symbolic associations may have complex multi-layered meanings, they have just two basic effects. They can reinforce something or create tension with something going on in the work. When a symbol reinforces, it fits the complements a theme, a character trait, a narrative's direction. In Pounds, the Rivered Merchant's Wife, the season of autumn with its traditional symbolic associations with sadness, the beginning of endings, the coming of death reinforces the young wife's anxiety at her husband's long absence. The leaves fall early this autumn in wind. The paired butterflies are already yellow with August over the grass in the west garden. They hurt me. I grow older. In addition to the autumnal association, this passage also draws on the symbolic associations of the west garden, with the end of the day, and, in this case, love and possibly life. When a symbol creates tension rather than reinforcement, its associations are in discord and don't fit something going on in the work. Notice how D.H. Lawrence creates conflicting resonance with the traditional symbol of the snake in Snake. At first, the speaker is conscious of the literal meaning of this particular snake. It is poisonous and capable of killing. And then here's the voices of my education, which tell him to kill it as an unwelcome representation of the evil underworld. On the other hand, the speaker fights the traditional symbolic meaning and sees the snake alternately as a gentle cow, a proud god, an uncrowned king in exile, something he'd like to know better. But the traditional symbolic power of the snake, really the speaker's mind, wins out, and the speaker comes to regret having lost his chance with one of the lords of life. It is the context of the work and the cultural tradition together that determine whether a symbol is working to create tension or to reinforce something. A danger that critical writers need to avoid is to be constantly looking for symbols in work. Symbol hunting for its own sake is risky. If you sense that a symbol or symbolic association is at work, respond to it honestly, but try not to force symbols on a work when they're just not there. Pre-writing about imagery and symbolism. Critical writers may decide or may be asked to write about such literary topics as discuss the imagery in work A. What is the relationship between imagery and characterization in work A? Evaluate how effectively imagery expresses the themes of work A. What image pattern does the author create and how do they relate to the themes of work A? Compare and contrast imagery in works A and B. Even when specific problems on imagery are not posed, you may find that building a significant portion of a paper around a discussion of imagery is the only way to deal effectively with certain works. Whatever the assignment or approach you choose, you'll need to be sensitive to your own reactions, and if the opportunity exists, the reactions of others, to imagery and how it affects the reader. As with other literary elements, you'll need to live with the work for a while in order to understand and appreciate its imagery. Of course, for in-class timed critical writing, you'll be relying either on your immediate experience of a new work or on your memory of a work you read previously. But for prepared essays where you have time to pre-write, draft, revise, and edit, you should try to read through a work several times over a period of time to allow your senses of the imagery to grow. The informal pre-writing methods, journal writing, brainstorming, and free writing, can be a rich source of your early reactions to imagery in a work read over a period of time. Each of the following pre-writing methods can help you generate material for a critical essay on imagery. Thought patterns. Classification is the obvious thought pattern that applies to imagery. We can classify the senses to which images appeal as we did to discover the bias towards sound in Nemirov's The Vacuum. And we can classify the types of figurative language, simile, metaphor, personification, symbol. Finally, we can use classification to see thematic patterns, as we discovered that the imagery in Shapiro's Autorec can be grouped around physical accident and disease. The thought pattern of comparison, contrast, is often built into paper topics on 2 or more works, in which case it's helpful to line up your classifications of senses, types of images, and thematic patterns in a comparison-contrast chart of the works. The pentad. The pentad perspectives what and how when turned into the specific imagery questions, what images are used and how are they constructed, will yield the same material more precisely covered by the detailed questions under the outlines. Imagery and senses and figurative language at the end of this section. The perspective's why, however, gets deeper into the author's purpose in creating certain images and image patterns, and such an insight can be profitably connected with the reader's experience. Focal points. The up-close perspective allows you to distinguish among types of images, similes, metaphors, and so on. The inside perspective examines the structure and interrelationships between the parts, tenor, and vehicle of individual images. The panoramic perspective looks for the patterns established within a work, as well as between works by the same author, by different authors, by authors in the same literary period, or by authors in different periods. Remember, if the formal methods appear to be repetitive, they're covering the same ground but from slightly different points of view, some of which work better for different writers. The formal methods of pre-writing about imagery and symbolism would include the questions and prose we've already illustrated in this chapter. Imagery and the senses. 1. Which senses are used? Sight, taste, touch, hearing, smell, and kinesthesia? 2. How clear degrees of concreteness and abstractness are the senses? 3. What is the focus of the imagery? Figurative language. Special connections between tenor, subject, and vehicle, image carrier. 1. What similes are used? 2. What metaphors are used? A. Type 1, tenor plus form of verb to be plus vehicle. B, type 2, tenor plus descriptive words but vehicle not mentioned. C, type 3, vehicle plus descriptive words but tenor not mentioned long before or not at all. 1. Metonymy, something associated with tenor standing for tenor. 2. Synecdoche, a part vehicle stands for the whole tenor. D. Personification. 3. Do any patterns or thematic threads run through the work's images? 4. Does the author draw on or create any special symbols? Written answers to these questions would also become material for your pre-writing portfolio. The material that you generate from any of the formal pre-writing methods can be scanned later for possible reshaping into middle paragraphs for your essay. The following student essay comparing and contrasting imagery in 2 poems is the result of selecting and reshaping material generated by pre-writing methods. Sample essay. Imagery in The Widow's Lament in Springtime and The River Merchant's Wife, a letter. Most of us have wondered what it would be like if a husband, wife, or friend passed away or just left us and did not return. The thought frightens us, and we choose not to discuss death or unexplained departure. In William Carlos Williams' The Widow's Lament in Springtime and Ezra Pound's The River Merchant's Wife, a letter, we see the effects of loss of a loved one on 2 women, the speakers of the poems. While the situations are clearly different, Williams' narrator is a widow and Pound's narrator is awaiting her husband's return, both women use the imagery of nature to convey 2 degrees of despair as they deal with their losses. Both poems are fairly concrete, with the sense of sight dominating most of the images. The River Merchant's Wife begins her letter with images of how she and her husband looked when they played and grew up together in the village of Chokin, she pulling flowers and he playing horse around her. The character of the images in the first 3 stanzas is happy and shows the innocence and shyness of the girl as she becomes a young and bashful wife. In the final 2 stanzas, however, the focus of the image changes to one of sadness and anxiety as she wonders when her husband will return. One image of sound, the monkeys made sorrowful noises ahead, and the rest of sight show how she has projected her sorrow onto nature. The leaves fall early this autumn in wind. The paired butterflies are already yellow with August over the grass in the west garden. They hurt me. I grow older. This passage draws on the symbolic connotations of autumn with the coming of death and sadness, and of the west with death. The paired butterflies suggest how she and her husband might approach age together and therefore remind her of her loneliness. The widow in William's poem does not have any hope of being reunited with her husband, and this may explain why there are no happy, innocent images at the beginning of her lament. She immediately connects her despair with the scene around her in a metaphor. Sorrow is my own yard, where the new grass flames as it has flamed often before, but not with the cold fire that closes round me this year. The image of flaming grass contrasts with the coldness she feels in her heart because of her husband's death. The river merchant's wife may be motivated to begin her letter with the pleasant images of youth as a way to lure her husband back, but the widow has no motive other than to pour out what she feels at the moment. The beauty of the plum tree and the cherry branches, which, though they were my joy formerly, created tension with her grief. I noticed them and turned away, forgetting. The basic difference between the 2 poems is underscored by the final images. The widow has nothing more to live for, and so the trees with white flowers that her son discovers identify the place where she thinks she might commit suicide, falling into the flowers in the marsh nearby. The beauty she had always responded to is now connected with her desired death. The final image in the river merchant's wife letter is also a place, but she connects it to the desire of reuniting with her husband, not her death. If he returns down the river Kiang, she will meet him at a point called Chofu Sa. The way she phrases this last sentence almost begs for an answer from him to let her know not only where he will return, but when. Both Williams and Pound show narrators whose despair is reflected in images of the nature around them. There are no value judgments coming from beyond the speaker about whether this grief is misplaced or whether the husbands are worthy of their extreme commitment. There's just the natural human coloring of loneliness in different degrees. Perhaps if the river merchant's wife receives no answer, the physical world will fully take on her sorrow, as it does for the widow, and she will want to sink into the river Kiang. Chapter 6. Setting. Setting is where it all happens. All action in life and literature happens somewhere in place and time. And in literature, the features of place and time, whether they're clear or vague, prominent or faint, important to the action or insignificant, constitute setting. Some authors make setting the center of a literary work, even giving it the stature of a character as it interacts with human characters, while other authors may give little or no information about setting and may depend instead on plot, characters, or narrative voice to create the major effects. To appreciate the range of place and time in a literary work, it helps to focus first close up and then at a distance, as we do with pre-writing technique of focal points. Let's consider place first. Close up places all the physical details of a particular scene. Color and lighting, style of clothing, furniture, drapes, items on a table and desks, or features of an outdoor terrain, contour of land, presence or absence of vegetation, weather, and so on, in as much detail as the writer chooses to give. Stepping back from a particular scene, we can consider the place of an entire work and observe if the action principally occurs in one place or if it shifts frequently, whether things happen mostly indoors or outdoors, in cities and towns or in nature, and whether the setting creates any dominant impression or mood. We can also consider time close up and at a distance in a literary work. In a particular scene, it would include all references to time of day, season of the year, or point in a person's life or a group's association. In the whole work, we can consider the importance of the total time covered as it affects character development and the historical time and place of the work, especially the relevance of certain values and ideas for the author and the society depicted. In William Faulkner's story, A Rose for Emily, Emily Grierson and her house, relics from a more genteel era in the South, are described with details of both physical place and historical time to show how out of place they are and how, upon her death, Emily joins the memory of her proper era. It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 1870s, set on what had once been our most select street. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighborhood. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. And now Miss Emily had gone to join the representatives of those august names, where they lay in the cedar-bemused cemetery among the ranked and anonymous names of Union and Confederate soldiers who fell at the bottom of Jefferson. You may be tempted to equate setting with imagery, but there is a distinction. Images help us orient ourselves to a literary work through the senses, and setting certainly incorporates many references to the senses. But it is traditional to speak of imagery in poetry and of setting in fiction and drama. An image, especially in a poem, can have a separate existence. The poet can create it to stand alone and prominent for a short time, such as the snake being compared to drinking cattle in Lawrence's Snake. All the images in a work make up its imagery, but do not necessarily function as a setting. A setting is the place of action, the where and when which locate what happens in a literary work. In many works, for example, lyrical poems, there is little action. An author may want only to create a pure feeling or mood uncluttered with characters in conflict. Robinson Jeffers' To the Stonecutters is such a work. While there is distinctive imagery, we couldn't refer to the stone monuments as a setting. There are poems, though, which are essentially narrative. They tell stories and have definite settings. You'll be safe in applying the term setting to imagistic details which create a place and time for action. The vocabulary of setting. When you write about setting, you'll need to use precise words to capture the place and time of action, how the setting affects the reader, as well as the characters and the action itself. You'll be writing such sentences as, in the scene at Penistone Crags, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff and Catherine reinforce their love for each other through a mutual love of the land, finding in themselves the rugged spirit of the moors, the blast of the wind, and the beauty of the flowering heather. Raskolnikov's shabby rented room, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, reflects his own neglected and disorganized life, with its yellow, peeling wallpaper, 3 old, fragile chairs, the worn overcoat used for a blanket, and the unopened books covered with dust on a stained table. In developing your eye and ear for setting, you'll need a vocabulary to translate the important details into critical observations. The words you'll use have to do with the qualities, often emotions, created by the setting. In some works, the author will use quality words to create the setting, while in other works, the reader needs to infer the qualities from the context. What goes on before and after the description? There follows a partial list of words that could describe various settings. The clusters describe similar qualities but with different shades of value or feeling. Barren, empty, stark, bleak, sterile, homey, comfortable, cheerful, warm, isolated, lonely, desolate, cold, threatening, frightening, horrifying, historic, antique, legendary, traditional, dreary, dark, mournful, sad, peaceful, tranquil, calm, romantic, mysterious, sensuous, dreamlike, turbulent, stormy, raging, tense, anxiety-filled, plush, elaborate, exotic, gaudy, cluttered, stuffy, stifling, open, spacious, free, airy, chaotic, turbulent, haphazard, orderly, organized, regimented, exuberant, happy, vibrant, dingy, rundown, worn. As we mentioned, this is a partial list, especially when you consider the vast number of adjectives and adverbs that could contribute to the quality and character of a setting. The use of setting in creating context. We mentioned above that sometimes the reader has to infer the qualities or significance of a setting from what comes before and after the context. But more often, the setting itself establishes the context as the frame of action, the where and when. Setting can reinforce character development by either paralleling it, as the aging Miss Emily and her house do in the example on page 85, or contrasting with it, as the romantic side of Francis Weed and his comfortable suburban home do in The Country Husband. Reinforce thematic development, as the idea of industrial inhumanity gains special credence through the factory setting in passage B of exercise 6.1. Create mood, that is, emotional atmosphere, that facilitates both character and thematic development, as physical details that become charged with feeling that color a scene or an entire work. 2 of the uses of setting can be seen in the following passage. during the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. Edgar Allan Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher. Poe, one of the great masters of mood, here uses a series of quality words, the adjectives and adverbs we have underlined, that create a context of gloom. Because the passage comes at the very beginning of the tale, it sets up the emotional frame in which the speaker will narrate the mental and physical decay of Roderick Usher, the main character. Two special uses of setting should be noted, to create ironic and symbolic effects. Irony is a complex literary term, but in general it describes an effect of unexpected or surprising contrast. A setting can be ironic when it seems out of place, with someone or something happening in a work. For example, in another Poe's story, The Cask of the Amontillado, a joyous Italian carnival and the party-colored jester's costume with cap and bells worn by Fortunato contrast ironically with the damp catacombs and the depraved plan of the narrator to bury Fortunato alive. As a symbol, an element of the setting or the entire setting can stand for a set of ideas or values. In Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, the woods come to symbolize the dark side of man and the potential of evil in everyone, while the town symbolizes civilization, which momentarily controls the hidden dimension. Since setting helps create context in a literary work, as the setting changes, the mood or dominant impression may likewise yield to something quite different. A good example of a work with shifting context and setting is Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, in which much of the action alternates between the Mississippi River and the shore. All of Huck's and Jim's troubles are associated with the shore. The widow Douglas, Huck's guardian and Jim's owner, Huck's father, Pap, and all those who try to find Huck and Jim once they make their escape on the river. The land means mystery and danger, as Huck finds out many times, while the river means freedom. For Huck, moving away from the structures of civilization. For Jim, moving toward the free states. At a point in the novel when Huck and Jim have been separated after a steamboat rams their raft, Huck rejoins Jim on the raft and tricks him into thinking the real catastrophe was only a dream. In the passage that follows, Huck relates how Jim interprets the dream in terms of the contrasting settings. Note, towheads are sandbars near the shore, overgrown with cottonwood trees. The lot of towheads was troubles we was going to get into with quarrelsome people and all kinds of mean folk. But if we minded our own business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the free states, and wouldn't have no more trouble. It had clouded up pretty dark just after I got onto the raft, but it was clearing up again now. With Jim's simple interpretation of things associated with the land and the meaning of the river, Huck's own mind clears for the moment, and Twain connects this with the lifting of the fog. The critical reader-writer needs to be cautious about interpreting a setting symbolically. Not all shifts in setting have a clear significance, as the shift between shore and river in Huckleberry Finn, but people do behave and feel differently in different places and times, and shifts do affect a story's direction. Then you would surely want to understand how this happens, how the author manipulates setting to create consistent or contrasting impressions. Setting in drama. Setting is especially important to the reading as well to the production of a play. The reader must imagine the setting, sometimes with very skimpy information from the playwright. For an actual theater production, the set design, lighting, and costuming are essential vehicles for the dramatic experience, and this explains why the team of playwright, director, and the various designers must work well. The situation in drama is different from that of other literary forms because even though the dramatist can give quite specific stage directions, the actual creation of the set depends heavily on the interpretation of the production team. It's not surprising to find quite startling differences among set designs for different productions of the same play. You may be asked to write about the importance of settings in plays you read or see produced. In the first situation, that of a critical reader, you'll be relying on information the playwright gives you on your own imagination. As a playgoer, you'll be responding to how others have imagined and created the setting. As in writing about setting in any literary work, your tasks will be to discuss how characters interact with the setting in a particular scene or the entire play, and to assess how effective the given setting is. The first task is analytical, the second, evaluative. Here are examples of both kinds of critical comment in the little collection of glass animals in Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie. Analytical. Laura Wingfield is never far away from her glass collection, which quite clearly stands for her own fragility. When Jim, her gentleman caller, breaks the unicorn, her giving it to him as a souvenir is a giving away of herself. It is something special on the other hand, but on the other, it is all she dares to give. Evaluative. The glass collection, so obviously symbolic of Laura, is a heavy-handed use of setting. We are constantly reminded by what characters say and by the stage directions that the tiny, fragile animals are reflections of the over-protected, unworldly Laura. The reader and the audience are likely to squirm when Laura tells Jim that the unicorns he breaks is less freakish and more like normal horses without its horn. Whether you build your essay around essentially analytical or evaluative comments will depend on the purpose of the topic or the assignment. Good analysis, an ability to read closely and note significant details, is necessary in all critical writing. Of course, evaluation and personal opinion may be either encouraged or discouraged in the direction of a particular assignment. Some instructors ask students to write reviews of plays, in which evaluation becomes the focus. If you're not certain of the options in a given assignment, be sure to ask. Pre-writing about setting. You may be writing about setting as the central topic of a critical essay, or you may be making observations about how setting affects theme or characterization. As we mentioned in Chapter 2, the value of the informal pre-writing methods, journal entries, free writing, and brainstorming, is to get out on paper, in an unstructured way, your first reactions to a literary experience. If you don't find any ideas about setting in whatever spontaneous methods you use, try directed free writing, zeroing in just on setting to see what you can generate. The formal pre-writing methods can be adopted by turning them into focused questions. As we've shown before, the different methods will often yield the same material because they probe the same subject, in this case setting, from slightly different perspectives. We'll use the setting in Porter's The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, JGW, throughout our illustrations to show how each method could be used. As always, the written answers to the questions you construct would become parts of your pre-writing portfolio for later use in writing the first draft of your essay. Thought pattern questions. Of the 4 thought patterns, definition, classification, analysis, processing cause and effect, and comparison contrast, the last 3 work nicely with setting. For classification, 2 large categories are already built into the concept of setting, place and time. We can ask, is there just one place and time, or are there several in JGW? There are 2 general places in the story. First, there was the world of Granny's sensations, her mind and body approaching death, and the shifting back and forth from clarity to vagueness. Second, there are places of action in the story, the bedroom in Cornelia's house where she lies dying, and rooms in her own home, the pantry and the attic with the letters from her husband and the man who jilted her. There are also multiple times in the story. In the present, when she is dying, Granny is 80 years old. There are at least 3 other time settings which she remembers. When she was 60, the children all grown up, and she first felt no longer needed. When she was a young mother, and the children all needed her. And then when she was about 20, and was jilted at the altar. For analysis, processing cause and effect, we can ask, does Granny, or anyone else, affect the setting? Does the setting affect Granny? When she was needed as a young wife and mother, she made her home into a safe and comfortable place for her family. Now as she lies dying in Cornelia's house, the bedroom seems to be closing in and obscuring her fading senses. In fact, the rooms in her home become metaphoric equivalents of her mind. While she was rummaging around, she found death in her mind, and it felt clammy and unfamiliar. For comparison contrast, we can construct 2 types of questions. If different settings in a work are distinct enough, we can ask, what are the different effects of the different settings on Granny? Her home and its rooms meant nothing to her as long as a family was there, depending on her. Now she's in a room she can't control, in Cornelia's house, waiting to die. To compare and contrast settings in different works, we could ask such a question as, what do their homes mean to Granny Weatherall and Frances Weed? While Granny's home is fulfilling so long as she has her family, Frances's home does have a family, but home is the place where no one listens to him or appreciates his need for romance. Pentad questions. The obvious part of this method related to setting is the scenic where and when. In itself, it asks the two most general and logical questions, and while you could generate some useful material from your written responses, the Pentad can be used to probe setting in a more productive way. The thing to do is make questions directed at setting out of the other four parts of the Pentad. Who? Who in the work either has an effect on the setting or is affected by the setting? What? What events in the literary work are affected by where and when they occur? How? How does any feature of the setting play a part in any major action? Why? Why does the author use the particular setting? Focal point questions. With the zoom lens feature of this method, we can look at setting from several vantage points, up close. This perspective would examine the importance of setting, or even a single object, in relation to the characters in a particular scene, with such a question as, how does Cornelia's bedroom play a part in the story's action? Inside. This perspective looks at a particular place to see if it has a life or dynamic of its own, asking what goes on in this place that doesn't depend on the human characters. In the case of JGW, everything in the house seems to depend on Granny, or at least her consciousness. Panoramic. This perspective could ask, how does this setting compare with settings in other works by the same author and works with similar themes by different authors? The topic or assignment would have to allow or encourage this type of comparison for any generated ideas to be useful later in the writing of the draft. Following is this sample student essay written on setting in The Country Husband. The uses of setting in Country Husband. A character may fit well into a setting or may seem out of place, depending on how he or she feels supported or frustrated by the place. Setting can reinforce or contrast with our impression of a character, and also the theme developed around a character. Both effects are true of Shady Hill, the suburban setting of John Cheever's The Country Husband. At times, Francis Weed seems to fit right in with the quiet manufactured lawns and houses of the upper middle-class environment, but at other times, he is stifled by its unromantic, low-key lifestyle. At those other times, he remembers and yearns for more exciting places and tries to live like a great lover who would never be caught dead in Shady Hill. Cheever uses setting to show how Francis Weed, modern suburban man, can belong to his world and feel overwhelmed by it at the same time. Francis is constantly bouncing back and forth between imagined settings on the one hand, where his sense of adventure is heightened, and the real setting of Shady Hill, and the commuter's world on the other hand, where his romantic imagination is regularly frustrated and ignored. In the story's opening scene, the plane crash is described with the vivid language of terror and shock. All but the children saw in their minds the spreading wings of the angel of death. The loud groaning of the hydraulic valves swallowed up the pilot's song, and there was a shrieking high in the air like automobile brakes. But when Francis tries to tell his friend Trace about the crash, the time and place are wrong, and he is like a writer who cannot create a setting. Trace listened to the story, but how could he get excited? Francis had no powers that would let him recreate a brush with death, particularly in the atmosphere of a commuting train journeying through a sunny countryside where already in the slum gardens there were signs of harvest. Francis's home in Shady Hill is the setting where most of the action occurs, and like the commuter train, it too is no place for the romantic imagination or the story of a crash. He comes home to fighting children, a daughter who reads true romance, no doubt to escape, and a tired wife who feels her youth and beauty have been lost looking after a family of ingrates. All the little details that Cheever injects into Francis's home and the neighborhood show the characters trying to overcome boredom with excitement. Mr. Nixon shouting at squirrels as if they were medieval villains, "Avaunt and quit my sight!" The dog, Jupiter, whose retrieving instincts and his high spirits were out of place in Shady Hill. The playing of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, out of tempo and with excessive emotion. The image of naked Mr. Babcock pursuing the naked Mrs. Babcock across the terrace, and so on. It is as if everyone in Shady Hill, not just Francis, has developed special ways of overcoming the social and psychological restraints imposed by the setting. One of Francis's methods is to let day and night dreaming take him to other settings where he can let out the hero-lover inside himself. At the Farquharsons' party, he recognizes the maid as a woman who was run out of a French town during the war for living with a German officer. As Francis remembers the scene of the woman's public punishment, the language shows a degree of sensitivity out of place in Shady Hill. It was a cool morning in the fall. The sky was overcast and poured down onto the dirt crossroads a very discouraging light. They were on high land and could see how like one another the shapes of the clouds and hills were as they stretched off toward the sea. Cheever uses this first remembered setting to heighten Francis's need for romance, as later that night he falls in love with Anne, the babysitter. When Francis dreams about Anne, his mind moves them both away from Shady Hill, to an ocean liner heading to Europe, then to Paris where they live together, and finally to an image of himself as a solitary skier in a challenging landscape. Down the mountain he swung, matching his speed against the contours of a slope that had been formed in the first ice age, seeking with ardor some simplicity of feeling and circumstance. The major effect of the two types of setting, remembered or imagined romantic scenes and deadening Shady Hill, is to sharpen Francis's senses and his appetite for fantasy. The change is most apparent the morning after his dream and becoming infatuated with Anne. Waiting for the morning train, he is especially attuned to the setting around him, which he would normally give no passing notice. It was a clear morning. The morning seemed thrown like a gleaming bridge of light over his mixed affairs. His spirits were feverish and high. The image of the girl seemed to put him into a relationship to the world that was mysterious and enthralling. Cars were beginning to fill up the parking lot, and he noticed that those that had driven down from the high land above Shady Hill were white with hoarfrost. The first sign of autumn thrilled him. Cheever never lets Francis's shifts in setting and emotion get very far before the dull Shady Hill world intrudes, as in the above-mentioned scene when fussy Miss Wrightson breaks the spell with her running on about the right curtains for her living room. The effect of setting on Francis at the end of the story seems purposely unclear. The reader is left to ask if Francis will always be slipping out of and back into the setting of Shady Hill. Is his happiness with woodworking in the cellar a permanent therapy for his love for Anne, or for romance in general? Probably not, when you consider how Cheever injects one last Francis-type image into the final sentence. Then it is dark. It is a night where kings in golden suits ride elephants over the mountains. Chapter 7. Structure. When we ask why things happen in a certain order, or why things seem to be so disordered in a work, we're interested in literary structure. Structure is not just the isolated parts of something. It's the relationship of the parts to each other and to the whole. The key word is relationship, how things work together. If you put all the parts of a high-performance formula racing engine on a garage floor, you don't have structure. You have a mess, or at least a jigsaw puzzle that will take a master mechanic to assemble. When it's all together and working in a car, then you have structure. Structure in a literary work isn't as easy to see as in a racing engine, but the same principle applies. Parts work together to make a whole. The basic pattern that most of us refer to when talking about literary structure is beginning, middle, end. Introduction, body, conclusion. Or rise in action, climax, falling action. These terms are widely applied to just about any creation that occurs over time. College essays, stories, poems, plays, music, jokes, recipes, speeches, and so on. Just as with a bridge or a building, the language of structure has to do with support. Does it hold together well? Does one part fit another? Are there any parts weak or strong? Does it fall apart after a certain point? And just as we don't know how sturdy the structure of a bridge is until we use it, so we can't say much about the structure of a literary work until we experience it. That is, until we read it. The engineer, architect, and writer all design structure, and it's use that tests structure. Critical writers are often uncomfortable when asked to discuss literary structure, perhaps because they feel there's something wrong with breaking a structure or a poem down into parts to see how the parts work. We're not uncomfortable slicing up a leaf stem in botany class, but we sometimes squirm if an exam question asks for an analysis of stanza form in a Shakespearean sonnet. Actually, it's healthy to be suspicious of literary analysis if the end result is that the reader gets so caught up with looking at small parts that the work becomes fragmented and no longer gives pleasure as a whole. What's the value of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea if we think of it only as a series of close encounters between a man and a great marlin? We can get all the fish stories we want in monthly issues of Field and Stream, some even more exciting than Hemingway's. It's how those close encounters work together to create a structure of meaning that makes the novel special and enduring and worthy of critical discussion. The good thing about critical analysis of a literary work is that it can end with synthesis, putting things back together. You can't do that with a leaf stem in botany class. Once you've sliced, pulverized, and boiled it, it won't hold the leaf anymore. The Shakespearean sonnet, though, will survive and can be put back together after its stanzas have been studied in relation to each other. As a critical writer, you should always be aiming at synthesis, whether your topic is structure, imagery, or any of the literary elements. Your own response to a work, relived and reassembled, counts. Without that, the result of your critical writing will be unfinished and unsatisfying. How to find structure. Authors use a variety of ways to segment or signal the structural divisions of a literary work. In fiction, there may be numbered or unnumbered sections consisting of several pages or paragraphs. There are 4 unnumbered sections in Cheever's The Country Husband. In longer works, there may be chapters and numbered parts containing several chapters. In drama, there are usually acts and scenes within the acts. And in poetry, there may be stanzas and numbered sections, rhyme and rhythm patterns, as well as special word formations, rhetorical figures, to identify divisions. All of these ways that authors use to set off parts of their work we can call textual clues, specific planned patterns that create quickly identifiable parts. Many works, however, don't have textual clues to identify structure and may move from beginning to end with no obvious breaks. In such works, the reader has to rely on a sense of things happening in a certain order for a certain purpose to appreciate the structure of meaning. Important shifts in ideas, moods, or feelings, character development, place and time, and events are thus called reader's cues. We develop the skill of recognizing these cues by being aware of changes in a work, such as stages of a character's growing maturity and self-knowledge, a new place or time for action, an important change in images, a shift in narrator's point of view, a shift in emotions from negative to positive or positive to negative, one key action coming to an end and another beginning, a subplot secondary story interweaving with the main story, introduction of a new idea or theme. These are all reader's cues, signaling change, the signposts of a work's structural parts. We'll discuss reader's cues specific to fiction, drama, and poetry later in this chapter. Reader's cues are clearly not as obvious as textual cues and require a careful reading in order to note the shifts. Let's look at a work with no textual cues to discover its structure. William Carlos Williams's The Widow's Lament in Springtime is a poem with 28 lines, no stanzas, and no rhyme pattern. How can we talk about this poem's structure? We could look for a sequence of images or a development of tone. For example, in lines 1 through 6, they contrast the widow's cold feeling of sorrow, tone, with an image of the flaming grass in her yard. Lines 7 through 8 factually state how long she was married, and lines 9 through 10 factually describe a plum tree, image. Lines 11 through 19 contrast bright cherry flowers, image, with the strength of her grief, tone, and explain that the flowers no longer please the widow as they used to. Lines 20 through 24 factually tell of her son's report of white flowering trees near the woods, image. And lines 25 through 28 express her desire to die in the marsh near the flowers. Throughout, she alternates between expressions of despair and beautiful images of spring. We can say that the poem's structure is a series of ironic contrasts between what would normally have given joy and what she really feels because of her husband's death. The changes, the shifting back and forth from positive images to negative feelings create the structure. Now we'll consider in more detail the 2 main skills for discovering structure: identifying parts and discovering their relationships. Identifying parts. A useful technique for identifying a work's structure is to make an outline of its major parts. An outline can be a paraphrase in that it says in your own words what the work says or implies. Its purpose, however, is not to follow the work word for word, but rather to summarize what happens or goes on in each important section. The section can be chapters, stanzas, segments indicated by the author, textual cues, or segments you identify, such as units of ideas or actions, reader's cues. If there are no obvious textual or reader's cues, you can always outline on the basis of paragraph or sentence units. The structural outline can become an important part of your pre-writing portfolio, whether you're planning a paper specifically on structure or simply gathering material for an open-ended topic. The outline is not the work's structure. It is a tool to identify parts. You have to go beyond the outline to discover relationships between the parts. In order to be useful, a structural outline should be concise enough to give an overview of the work structure, yet detailed enough to give you something to say about each part. 2 levels of outlining: Roman numerals for major divisions, from textual and reader's cues, and capital letters for describing what each part does, should be sufficient for most poems and stories. Here's a structural outline of Robinson's The Mill. 1. First stanza. A. Describes how the wife waited for the miller, how it seemed a long time. B. Give the miller's last words about the lack of millers. The second stanza, A, describes the wife's vague fear and then her discovery of her dead husband. B, states the indifference of the dead miller to where his wife goes now. And then 3, the third stanza, A, describes the wife's desire to choose a method of suicide that will leave no trace of her. B, describes a swamp pond at night that would serve her purpose. We can see that a narrative progression that alternates between wife's and the miller's problems and the solutions they choose. Now that we've identified the parts, we have to do something more. We have to describe how they work together, what their relationship is. Discovering and describing relationships. Because we experience literary works over time, the effects of structure accumulate. We may not fully appreciate an individual part or section until we've read the next part or the entire work. The beginning of a work may take on greater significance when we see how our character turns out in the middle or at the end. For example, in Chapter 3 of Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, young Pip agrees to bring food and clothes to an escaped convict in hiding. The event tells us something about the boy's generosity and bravery, but seems to have no greater significance. However, near the very end of the novel, in Chapter 39, we learn that a mysterious stranger who has been anonymously providing Pip with money for an education and an independent life all along is none other than the grateful convict he helped as a young lad. This structured relationship, which spans many chapters, creates surprise and revelation. In order to discover and describe relationships between parts, we need a set of terms to cover structural effects on a reader. The parts of a work, experienced in their complete sequence, can have 2 basic effects. They can reinforce each other or contrast with each other. Reinforcing effects. 1. All parts lead to a logical conclusion, some parts causing others to happen and contributing to an overall effect. 2. One or more parts interrupt each other, as with flashback. These fill in a gap or provide helpful information. Like background. Contrasting effect. 1. One or more parts creates an unexpected but effective turn of events or change in effect, perhaps with irony. The contrast can be between characters, settings, moods, or themes. Whether the part of a work reinforce or contrast with each other, the critical writer needs to relate these basic effects to the author's purpose in the work, developing a thematic idea, expressing an emotion, or creating a pure sensory experience. We can now specify 3 tasks in writing about structure. 1. Identifying the parts, outlining from textual and reader's cues. 2. Discovering and describing the relationships between parts that either reinforce or contrast. 3. Relating structural effects to author's purpose. Now we can complete our structural analysis of Robinson's The Mill. In looking at the outline of the poem, we can see that its 3 stanzas all reinforce each other by going along in time from when the miller and his wife are alive to when the miller is dead and his wife is about to kill herself. We don't at first understand the miller's declaration in the first stanza that there are no millers anymore. But the words do fit in once we discover the miller's suicide in the second stanza. Presumably he didn't fit into a world where the old technology of milling grain has been replaced with a new technology. The parts of the poem altogether set up a logical structure. The miller's wife waits alone. The miller has killed himself because he sees no place for millers in the world. The wife discovers her husband hanging in the mill and goes off to find some less conspicuous place for her own death, most likely because she too now sees no place for herself in the world. This poetic narrative is the tragedy of 2 people who choose not to live when their main reasons for living are taken away. The important thing to remember is that structural analysis should go hand in hand with structural synthesis. It's not enough to just identify the parts. The critical writer must also discuss their relationship in terms of the work's larger purpose or effect. The poem develops its theme first by showing the miller's problem and solution, stanzas 1 and 2, and then reinforces the theme by showing the parallel problem and solution of the miller's wife, stanzas 1, 2, and 3. Structure in fiction and drama. Although fiction, short stories and novels, and drama are very different literary forms, they share important features that shape plot. Plot is the term that has come to mean structure in works that tell stories. Plot development suggests a movement of events from one point to another toward a happy or comic ending, a tragic ending, a cliffhanger, or an ambiguous ending. Continuing this metaphor of movement, the reader is carried along by shifts and changes in key literary elements. The critical writer needs to note and account for the effects of these changes which make up a work's plot development. A useful method for understanding structure in fiction and drama is to make questions out of the textual and reader's cues, such as, how does each chapter, act, scene, etc. affect plot development? Are there stages of a character's maturity or self-knowledge that affect plot development? How do changes in place and time, setting, affect plot development? Do any patterns of conflict emerge that affect plot? Does a particular section introduce any new ideas or themes? Ultimately, any of the literary elements that undergo change have an effect on plot development. In the remainder of this section, we'll show how to apply such questions to the structure of the first act of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Textual clues. What easily recognizable clues does Shakespeare provide to indicate structure? Changes in place and time are divided into 5 scenes in Act 1. 1. Castle battlements in Elsinore, Denmark, from midnight to dawn. 2. The royal court the morning after scene 1. 3. The royal court just after scene 2. 4. Castle battlements just before midnight. 5. Castle battlements just after scene 4. Readers' cues. What major actions occur in each scene of Act 1? This question calls for a paraphrase outline. 1. The soldiers Bernardo and Marcellus report to Horatio, Hamlet's friend, of 2 previously nightly appearances of a ghost. Then the ghost appears to all 3 in the image of the dead king, Hamlet's father. They agree to tell Hamlet. 2. At court, the new king, Hamlet's uncle Claudius, and his new wife, Hamlet's mother, Gertrude, ask Hamlet to remain with them instead of returning to school. Then, when all others leave, Hamlet expresses his disgust with the hasty marriage of his mother and uncle in a soliloquy, a speech made with no other characters present. Horatio arrives to tell Hamlet of his father's ghost, and Hamlet, his suspicions aroused, agrees to watch with Horatio and the soldiers that night. 3. Polonius, counselor to the king, gives his son, Laertes, who is returning to school in Paris, advice on keeping a modest, frugal, and wise lifestyle. He also lectures his daughter, Ophelia, about not taking seriously Hamlet's recent advances. 4. On the castle battlements that night, Hamlet, Horatio, and Marcellus see this terrifying ghost, which beckons to Hamlet to follow him. 5. With Hamlet removed from the others, the ghost reveals how Claudius murdered him for the crown and for his wife. He charges Hamlet not to let the king's spirit wander unavenged. The ghost leaves, and Hamlet vows a single-minded commitment to avenge the murder. Rejoining his friend, he swears them to secrecy, as he curses the fate that has singled him out to bring justice to Denmark. What shifts in emotion are there? Scene 1 is essentially mysterious and frightening. Scene 2 initially shows Hamlet's coolness towards Claudius and Gertrude. The soliloquy uncovers the heat of his disgust, and finally, the report of his father's ghost creates anxiety and suspicion. When speaking to those he trusts, Hamlet shows good humor and wit, but for the most part he is clearly disturbed. Coming right in the middle of Act 1, Scene 3 provides a comic break and introduces the parallel or subplot surrounding Polonius and his family. The emotions of Scene 4 and 5 closely interweave as the fear and mystery of Scene 1 return, yielding to the determined wrath of the ghost and now confirmed anger of Hamlet, and his first expressed regret that all of the responsibility for writing things has descended on him. How do stages of a character's maturity or self-knowledge affect the plot? The answer to this question might closely parallel the shifts in emotion Hamlet's in the 5 scenes of Act 1. While we probably wouldn't say that Hamlet matures greatly by the end of Scene 5, we could say that he certainly comes to understand his world better, that there can be spirits, that his uncle murdered his father, and that he alone with this knowledge must do something. What themes and ideas are introduced? Because it is the beginning of the play, Act 1 introduces, progressively in the structure, several major themes. Scene 2 touches on the nature of relationships between members of a family. A son, a dead father, and a mother recently married to the dead father's brother. Scene 2 also raises the problem of what to do about feelings that can't be directly expressed or acted on. The basically comic Scene 3, through Polonius's well-meaning but pompous advice to his son and daughter, introduces the theme of how difficult, even absurd, it may be to live by rigid precepts and rules. A theme that becomes more important later in the play when Hamlet can't act on what he believes is his duty. And Scene 5 presents the theme of responsibility, of acting on a just cause, and how heavy a weight that can be. The written answer to these text and reader cue questions become part of the pre-writing portfolio, and as you can see, would provide the critical writer with many ideas for shaping an essay on structure. At the end of this chapter, we present a sample essay on the structure in Act 1 of Hamlet to show the finished result of this pre-writing activity. Structure in poetry. Just like stories and plays, poems happen over the time we read them. The time is shorter for most poems, though there are poems longer than some novels, Homer's Iliad, Milton's Paradise Lost, and some readers can dwell on a 10-line poem longer than it takes to read a book-length play. Poetry is usually much more highly concentrated and compressed and charged than fiction and drama. Of course, there is poetic prose in some fiction, and some plays are written in verse, so let's acknowledge obvious exceptions from the start. But because poems tend to be more compressed, Poetic structure occurs over a shorter space, both in time and on the page, and compression can help the reader identify structure. Poets also have evolved a host of special techniques for structuring poems. Poems need to be read carefully, closely, and with a sensitivity to the various structuring techniques that operate. Remember, though, you don't want the dismembered poem lying scattered on the floor like the racing engine after you've read and analyzed it. When you know how it works, well or poorly, synthesize. Put it back together by relating the parts to the total reading experience. The critical writing you do can be the bridge between a first confused or uncertain reading and that fulfilling pleasure that comes from an informed reading. The process of reading for structure. In order to describe the structure of a poem, first read the poem through one or more times until you're comfortable with its meaning. As you read, try to note any patterns or repetition. These patterns can operate at the levels of individual words, lines, stanzas, or even larger divisions of the poem. We can group the kinds of patterns under two large headings: sound and shape, and meaning. Patterns of sound and shape include rhyme, alliteration, assonance and consonance, rhythm and meter, stanzas. Patterns of meaning include rhetorical purpose, description, narration, exposition, argumentation, order of images and symbols. Patterns of sound and shape. Rhyme. Rhyme is the repetition of the major vowel sound in rhymed words, such as no blow, bite light, and appeal steel. Exact or true rhymes also repeat the consonant sound following the vowel, as in the last two pairs just given. Slants or half rhymes are close but not true rhymes, as in does and does. The most familiar and easy to spot rhymes are end rhymes, those that come at the end of lines. But rhyming words can also appear within the same lines or between lines. These are called internal rhymes. The following four lines of Sir Philip Sidney illustrate both end and internal rhymes. The internal rhymes, in this case some are slant and some exact, are circled and connected. Note the use of small letters to show the repetition of end rhymes. A. Designate all end words rhyming with dust. B. All end words rhyming with things. A new end sound following these lines, not rhyming with dust or thing, would be designated C, and so on. The rhyme pattern described by these letters is called rhyme scheme. In this case, AB, AB. Leave me, O love, which reachest bust to dust, and thou, my mind, aspire to higher things. Grow rich in that which never taketh rust, whatever fades but fading pleasure brings. Rhymed words can have significance beyond the mere repetition of sound. The poet must carefully select important words to be rhymed. For example, dust, rust. In Sidney's poems are nouns that describe decay in the physical world, which he contrasts with the higher things of the mind. A poet may also select rhyming sounds that have certain character fitting the meaning or intended effect, such as brick, kick, stick for a hard, harsh sound, or fair air, hair for a soft sound. But be cautioned. Critical writers often get carried away making preposterous claims for effects not present or intended. In the Sidney selection, there is no significance at all to the things brings rhyme. The two words simply fit the established rhyme pattern. More often than not, a rhyme is just a rhyme. However, if a pattern of pleasant or unpleasant rhyming sound seems to fit a poem's meaning, then by all means mention that in your discussion, but don't go forcing significance on the poem's sounds. Alliteration, assonance, and consonance. These are three kinds of sound repetition that occur within and between lines. Alliteration, the most common of the three, is the repetition of the consonant sound at the beginning of words, such as breath, bloat, bargain. Consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds at the middle or end of words, as in Howard Nemerov's The Vacuum Cleaner is a bag limp as a stopped lung. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds in the words that do not rhyme, as in the first line of Carl Shapiro's Autoreg. It's quick soft silver bells beating, beating. Notice too the alliteration of soft silver and bell beating, beating. As with rhyme, the critical writer should be careful not to force interpretations on these special repetitions of sound unless the pattern fits meaning or creates an appropriate effect. In Shapiro's line, the assonance of the short I effectively duplicates the ring of the bell that an ambulance of the 1940s, see publication date, would make. These three types of sound repetition have the effect of connecting words. The words may reinforce each other, beast blood, or may contrast with each other, fiery frost. Whatever relationship is established, sound repetition used by a master at the craft can be central to the pleasure of reading lines like the following from D.H. Lawrence's Snake, in which the soft est sound complements the quiet action of sipping. He sipped with his straight mouth, softly drank through his straight gums into his slack, long body, silently. Rhythm and meter. Much that we pay attention to depends on beats and pulses, the rhythms of life. Sometimes we want them to be regular and predictable, as with heartbeats or the vibrations of a tuning fork. Other times we like rhythms to be irregular or to vary an established regular beat, such as the complex syncopations of a jazz performance. At the root of rhythm is a pleasure, both physical and intellectual, that finds expression in simple toe tapping, dancing, singing, and just spotting a pattern. In poetry, as in speech, rhythm depends on the way words are pronounced, with accents or stresses on some syllables and no accents or softer stresses on other syllables. For one-syllable words, through normal pronunciation doesn't help determine stress, so we have to rely on meaning. Notice how meaning determines how the word her is stressed in the following sentence. The president shook her hand. The president shook her hand, not the ambassador's hand. In the first sentence, hand would have greater stress than her, but in the second sentence, her takes the greater stress to set up the necessary contrast with ambassadors. When the rhythm in a poem falls into a more or less regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, we call it meter, from the Greek word for measure, and we measure the pattern by seeing how the stressed and unstressed syllables are grouped. The process of scanning, or scansion, begins with marking the stresses in several or all of the lines. The examples below are taken from poems by Edgar Allan Poe. "O lady bright, can it be right, this window open to the night?" The next step is to identify the predominant foot, usually a sequence of one stressed and one or more unstressed syllables, marking each foot off with a slash. To discover a meter, we 1. Mark accents in multi-syllable words according to pronunciation, win, do. 2. Determine whether one syllable word receives a stress or not according to their importance in the line, the night. In the Poe selection, the predominant foot is one unstressed syllable and one stressed syllable, with 4 of these feet in each line. "O lady bright, can it be right, this window open to the night?" The meter is named by the type of predominant foot and the number of feet, the line length in a typical line of poem. Below are the basic types of feet and line lengths. An iamb, or iambic meter's pattern, is unstressed stress. A monometer's length is 1 foot. A trochee, or trochaic meter's pattern, is stressed unstressed. A dimeter is 2 feet. Anapest, or anapestic meter, is unstressed unstressed stressed. A trimeter has 3 feet. Dactyl, or dactylic meter, is stressed unstressed unstressed. Tetrameter has 4 feet. Spondee, or spondaic meter, is stressed stressed. A pentameter has 5 feet. Pyrrhic, or pyrrhic meter, is unstressed unstressed. A hexameter's length is 6 feet. An amphibrach, or amphibrachtic meter, is unstressed stressed unstressed. A heptameter has 7 feet. An amphimacer, or amphimasic meter, has stressed unstressed stressed pattern, and an octameter has 8 feet. Using these charts, we can see that the Poe selection containing iambic feet, 4 to a line, would be called iambic tetrameter. No poem could sustain our interest and toleration with perfectly regular meter, so poets use metrical variation for a variety of reasons, to more closely duplicate the naturally varied rhythms of human speech, to emphasize keywords, to imitate some nonspecific speech rhythms, such as that of waves or machines, or to surprise. In a different poem, but with the same basic iambic tetrameter pattern, Poe uses a powerful spondee, stressed stress, to open the first line. "Lo, death has reared himself the throne." The spondee combines an ancient attention-getting word, lo, meaning look here or there, with the equally stressed death to create a strong double accent appropriate for this opening ceremonious tone. Variation can also occur through the tension set up between normal pronunciation and meter. In yet another poem using iambic tetrameter, Poe's favorite, we can feel this tension centered around the word romance. Romance, who loves to nod and sing, with drowsy head and folded wing. Normal pronunciation puts the stress in romance on the first syllable and thus makes the word a trochaic, stressed unstressed foot, but the predominant foot in the line is iambic, unstressed stress. The type of metrical variation closest to speech with no regularly repeated pattern of stresses and irregular line length is called free verse, a meter most characteristic of modern poetry. Free verse does, however, use other devices of repetition, such as sound and sentence structure, as you can see in the following passage from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. "Now I will do nothing but listen. To accrue what I hear into this song, to let sounds contribute toward it. I hear bravures of birds, bustle of growing wheat, gossip of flames, clack of sticks cooking my meals. I hear the sound I love, the sound of the human voice. I hear all sounds running together, combined, fused, or following, sounds of the city and sounds out of the city, sounds of the day and night. The repeated structure of exact words, I hear, the sound of, the sounds of, the sounds of, and the pattern, noun plus noun, builds a list of grammatically parallel images showing the expanse of the poet's vision and experience. Note also the alliteration throughout. Stanzas. Stanzas are groups of lines usually set off by a space that may be carefully structured by traditional patterns of rhyme and meter, or they may be tailored to a particular poem. Below are definitions of several of the most common stanzas, in ascending order of length. Couplet. 2 lines rhymed, usually iambic pentameter or tetrameter. Closed couplets contain a complete sentence or thought and come to a strong pause or complete stop at the end. Open couplets carry over the first line of the next couplet. Triplet or tarset. 3 lines rhyming consecutively, triplet, or interlocking with the rhyme of the next stanza. Terza rima, ABA, BCB, CDC, etc., with no specific meter. Quatrain. 4 lines with or without special rhyme and metrical pattern. Possible rhyme patterns are ABAB, ABCB, ABBA, or unrhymed. Meters may be iambic pentameter or tetrameter for all 4 lines, or alternating iambic tetrameter and trimeter. Quatrains are by far the most popular stanza in poetry, having numerous possibilities for balance and imbalance, reinforcement and contrast in the 2 pairs of lines. Cinquain. 5 lines with no determined meter and rhyme except for the highly structured and popular limerick, in which lines 1, 2, and 5 are anapestic trimeter and lines 3 and 4 are anapestic dimeter, all of which rhyme AA, BBA, and swing along to their happy or lusty ending. Sixain, sestet, or sestina. 6 lines, usually iambic pentameter or tetrameter, with such possible rhyme schemes as ABABCC, really a quatrain in a couplet, and ABABAB. Septet, sometimes called rhyme royale or Chaucerian stanza. 7 lines of iambic pentameter, rhyming ABABBCC, and not very common. Octave or octet. 8 lines, usually iambic tetrameter or pentameter. The numerous possible rhyme patterns include ABABABCC, the popular ottava rima, ABAAABAB, ABABCDCD, ABCDDEFE, ABBAABBA, and ABBACDDC. As you can see, the octave can be joined by 2 quatrains following for various structural possibilities. Spenserian stanza. 9 lines rhyming ABA, BB, CB, CC. The first 8 being iambic pentameter and the last iambic hexameter, invented by Edmund Spenser for his 16th century allegory, The Faerie Queene. This stanza has attracted several major poets, including Keats and Shelley, who has used it in Adonis. Sonnet. The sonnet is not actually a stanza. It's a special type of poem with several different specialized stanza forms, which have been quite popular in the history of poetry. The Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, named for the 14th century Italian poet who perfected the form, has 2 parts. The octave, or first 8 lines, which rhymes ABBA, ABBA, and the sestet, the last 6 lines, which may rhyme CDE, CDE, or CDC, DCD. The English or Shakespearean sonnet consists of 3 quatrains, usually rhyming ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, and a closing couplet, GG. In this text, George Meredith's Lucifer in Starlight in Exercise 7.7 is a Petrarchan sonnet, and Shakespeare's The Time of the Year is Shakespearean. Stanzas are patterns of shape that make a bridge to patterns of meaning. Stanzas may contain 1 or more complete ideas or emotions. They may contain 1 or more complete syntactic units, clause or sentence. Or they may contain only parts of ideas, emotions, and syntactic units running together with and depending on others. Adjacent stanzas to make sense. The critical writer is concerned with how stanzas structure the reading of the poem. Do they segment the poem with nearly perfect regularity, or does the poem's meaning flow through the major parts without strong pauses or stops at the points of division? And as with the smaller devices of sound, how do the larger shapes relate to one another? Do they create similarity and reinforce, or difference and contrast? Patterns of meaning. How does a poem mean? The title of a well-known book by poet John Ciardi asks a question about poetic meaning. It's more important to know how a poem means, how we come to understand through experiencing the poem, than what a poem means, a fixed paraphrase of its theme or expressed emotion. If poets only wanted to get ideas and feelings across, they might only write essays and give speeches. The fact is, though, poems do get ideas and feelings across, and we receive meaning by reconstructing it more or less the way the poet wants us to, in a certain order. One of the most important ways that poets organize meaning is in terms of rhetorical purpose, the way a poem affects the audience. Rhetorical purpose. We traditionally classify the purpose of communication into 4 large categories, as follows. Description. A descriptive structure portrays the physical characteristics of an object, person, setting, or isolated action. It usually consists of a series of details and qualities added to a subject. Narration. A narrative structure describes a complete, complex action or tells a story. It usually includes characters, conflicts, turning points, climaxes, resolutions, or no resolutions, and the order of events may move forward chronologically, backwards in flashbacks, or unpredictably. Exposition and expository structure may explain an idea or procedure, or it may express an emotion. It may begin with a stated idea or emotion and develop it through one or more examples. Or it may begin with one or more example and conclude with a generalization. It may also simply present examples and leave the generalization unsaid. Argumentation. An argumentative structure expresses an opinion, argues and proves a point, or tries to convince by appeals to emotion. It usually has a main proposition or thesis and may have various proofs or reasons, with examples of benefits and consequences, refutations of opponents' arguments, and or emotional attacks and appeals to sentiment. Few pieces of writing fit completely into a single category. The purpose is usually interweave. To narrate, you often have to describe. To argue requires explaining ideas. The 4 purposes, however, are useful for naming tendencies, and even poems that have complex mixed rhetorical purposes may be structured by one overriding purpose, or may have parts developed essentially by one purpose. One example of an apparent rhetorical purpose in a poem is Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro. Here we have a poem structured by a single descriptive metaphor. The first line represents the tenor, faces in a crowd, and the second line represents the vehicle, flower petals. One might be tempted to reach for an expository or argumentative pattern of meaning, perhaps the vitality of humanity set against the dinginess of a city. That would be stretching the poem. Poems do invite stretching, but the poem itself is simply structured by the comparative description. We've already discussed how narrative structure works in a poem. The mill. Let's see how description and exposition can work together in a poem, in Shapiro's Autorec. The first 24 lines are descriptive, a series of details that fill out the scene of the ambulance arriving at the accident, picking up the victims, leaving, and the physical effect of the scene on the spectators, speakers. At line 25, the poem's structure becomes expository as the speaker expresses the crowd's feelings and interpretations of the significance of the accident. So even though there are 4 irregular stanzas, patterns of shape, there are 2 basic rhetorical purposes, patterns of meaning, describing the scene and expressing the crowd's grasping for meaning in the horror. That structure the poem. You may find patterns of shape, stanzas, meshing perfectly with patterns of meaning, but that's not always the case. A fine example where different patterns do mesh perfectly is Robert Herrick's To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. In this Carpe Diem, Seize the Day, Live for Now poem, we have an essentially argumentative structure which is developed using description and exposition. The first 2 stanzas use descriptive images to illustrate the idea that things in nature have only a short time to thrive and fulfill their purposes. Rosebuds that will die and the sun that will set. The third stanza is more purely expository statement that life is much better in youth when there is excess energy than in old age when things get worse. All leads to the 4th and final stanza, which begins with the word then and states the poem's thesis to young women, namely that they should not reject passion because, presumably, like the rose and the sun, their days are numbered. Thus this poem's structure meshes the patterns of shape, 4 stanzas, with the patterns of meaning, an argument consisting of 2 descriptive illustrations, 1 expository reason, and a thesis. Order of images and symbols. Another important pattern of meaning is created by the order of key images and symbols in a poem. Our experience of a poem is influenced by the qualities of sensory details and figurative language encountered over time as they build to a dominant impression, or through the clashing of conflicting images that create surprise or even anxiety in the reader. Consider the order of images surrounding the snake in Lawrence's Snake. Our impression first coincides with our traditional reaction to a reptile. Then the poet compares him to peaceful cattle, then to a god, and finally to a king in exile. The order of images is meant to move the readers away from the traditional negative image of snakes to one that explores the positive side of the dark forces that snakes have always symbolized. The structure allows a movement from one point of view to another. In poetry, then, the reader's experience is structured by patterns of sound, shape, and meaning. The critical writer needs to be aware of how these devices work on him or her during the reading experience. Pre-writing guided by the kinds of questions we've asked in this section will allow you to record your experience and draw it out on paper in rough form. The pre-writing record of your poetic encounters will eventually become the finished critical essay. This sample essay on structure in Act 1 of Shakespeare's Hamlet is shaped around the identification of textual and reader's cues discussed earlier in this chapter. Structure and illumination in Act 1 of Hamlet. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. With these words, the fifth and final scene of Hamlet, Act 1, ends with the protagonist expressing what we all feel when faced with something we would rather not do. Hamlet's chore is especially hard. He must avenge the murder of his father at the hand of his uncle and bring justice to Elsinore. The way Shakespeare moves the reader or playgoer to Hamlet's crisis of knowledge and responsibility at the end of Act 1 is a fascinating study of dramatic structuring. What begins as a simple ghost story develops into a powerful conflict between the dead, the living, and the voices of Hamlet's inner self. The most obvious structural device Shakespeare uses in Act 1 is the five senses occupying two locations: the castle battlements of Elsinore, scenes 1, 4, and 5, and the royal court, scenes 2 and 3. During the time frame of one full day, from just after midnight to the same time the following morning, Shakespeare wants to raise dramatic curiosity as he raises Hamlet's fear and anxiety. Before he even introduces his hero, Shakespeare uses scene 1 to reveal the ghost, who resembles Hamlet's dead father. At the end of this scene, the reader, like Hamlet's friends, want to know what the ghost is and why it appeared. Hamlet is the key, but instead of resolving the mystery by jumping to the next night, the playwright shows us Hamlet in the world of the court. Scene 2 has 3 sections. The new king, Hamlet's uncle Claudius, and his new wife, Hamlet's mother Gertrude, trying to persuade Hamlet to remain with them and not return to school. Then, Hamlet alone in a soliloquy expressing how repulsed he is at his mother's hasty marriage so soon after his father's death. And finally, Horatio's report of the ghost's appearance and Hamlet's aroused suspicions. Scene 2 also leaves the reader anxious for the inevitable encounter between Hamlet and the ghost, but Shakespeare holds off for another scene, 3, which momentarily breaks up the rising suspense. Scene 4 brings the reader back to the castle battlements for the awaited encounter. When the ghost appears, Hamlet is appropriately stunted and willingly goes off alone with the ghost to learn its secret. Scene 5 finally reveals all the elements that will set up the rest of the play: the murder of Hamlet's father and the ghost's charge that Hamlet avenged the foul deed. The scene ends with Hamlet's cursing the fate that has singled him out for such a great responsibility, and the reader is now prepared to see Hamlet perform his task. The structure of Act 1 can also be traced in the shifting emotions of the character. Mystery and fear run through the soldier, and Hamlet's friend in the first scene, as Horatio says, "This bode some strange eruption to our state, but soft, behold, lo, where it comes again! I'll cross it, through it, blast me, stay, illusion." In the second, Claudius and Gertrude's concerned, we with wisest sorrow think on him, for Hamlet's ongoing grief mingle with Hamlet's repressed disgust, which is suspended by his uneasiness and suspicion after learning the ghost resembles his father. All is not well, sit still, my soul. The third scene interrupts the rising emotions of the first 2 scenes with Polonius's good-natured concerns for Laertes' return to Paris and Ophelia's emotional turmoil over Hamlet. Scenes 4 and 5 return to the fear and mystery of scene 1. What may this mean, that thou, dead corpse, revisits thus the glimpses of the moon, making night hideous, and progress into the wrath of the ghost and the anger of Hamlet? Yes, by heaven, O most pernicious woman, O villain, smiling damned villain. Act 1 ends on the note of Hamlet's anguished cry over his duty. Emotions are not the only structuring device in Act 1. The reader is also introduced to several main topics throughout the 5 scenes. Scenes 2 and 3 bring up the nature of relationships between members of a family. A son, his responsibility to a dead father, and his attitudes towards his mother and uncle. A father, Polonius, and his advice to a son and daughter. Scene 2 also conveys the dilemma of suppressed emotions and what to do about them. Hamlet must resolve his anger towards his mother and uncle. Scene 3 raises the question of how much a life can be based on rigid principles. Polonius' advice to Laertes. Scene 5 presents the theme of responsibility for acting on what one believes to be right and how heavy a burden such responsibility can be. We can therefore see several levels of structure in Act 1. The reader's experience is ordered by obvious shifts in place and time, but more importantly by the progression and interruption of emotions, and by the distinctive themes introduced. These devices of structure enable the reader to move with Hamlet through suspicion and fear to an understanding of his world and his need to do something about it. Chapter 8. Point of view and tone. Point of view in literature refers to the angle or perspective from which a work is told. We commonly think of a speaker of poems and a narrator of stories. In drama, a play isn't so much told as conveyed by the speeches and actions of characters representing a variety of viewpoints. Point of view is an extremely important literary element because through it, the author determines not only what the reader perceives, but how. Just as the pre-writing technique of focal point helps the critical writer use point of view to examine the subject of an essay, so the creator-writer uses one or more of these perspectives, up close and side panoramic, to draw in the reader. The uses of point of view. The key to understanding point of view is the distinction between the author on the one hand and the speaker-narrator on the other. Even though an author may choose to express him or herself through the teller, the two should be kept distinct, because more often than not, the speaker-narrator is a device for getting across a slightly or radically different point of view from the author's own. For example, in Herman Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener, the narrator is Bartleby's employer, a lawyer, who sees Bartleby every day and is exasperated by his stated preference not to do anything. Ultimately, the narrator can't decide what to do with this strange person, and though Melville may have been acutely aware of moral obligations in this case, the narrator can only show desperation. Bartleby was one of those beings of whom nothing is ascertainable. What my own astonished eyes saw of Bartleby, that is all I know of him. What shall I do? What shall I do? What ought I to do? What does conscience say I should do with this man, or rather ghosts? Rid myself of him? I must. Go he shall, but how? Persona. A term that has come to be associated with the speaker-narrator is persona, from the Latin word for mask, suggesting that the author used a field or filter to keep the literary work from becoming a completely transparent self-portrait or confession. The special persona a writer chooses for a point of view may explore or hide an aspect of the writer's own personality, express an idea or feeling that the writer wouldn't express in private life, or create an attitude totally opposite from the writer's own. So when you are writing about point of view, try to get in the habit of saying the speaker-narrator says or implies, rather than the author says. Narrative stance. Authors use point of view to create relationships between the speaker-narrator and the reader, the characters and the subject or theme of the work. This stance, we can imagine falling somewhere along a scale depending on the narrator's attitude and involvement in the work. Notice that as the narrator becomes more or less sympathetic, moving away from the center of neutral detachment, he or she becomes fleshed out as an actual character who participates in the action of the work. The young wife in Pound's The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter, is an example of a sympathetic, involved speaker who is also a main character. She describes her childhood, courtship, and marriage with a respectful commitment, though we can imagine a deep loneliness running beneath the surface of the words she addresses to her absent husband. We can contrast the river merchant's wife with the detached, objective speaker of Robinson's The Mill, who simply reports the tragedy of the miller and his wife, seeming to have little voice as a character and no personal involvement with the characters. Unsympathetic, hostile speaker-narrators are not common in literature, and their hostility is usually directed toward themselves or other characters. An example is one of the speaker in John Dryden's Macflanoe, a 17th century satire on a pompous playwright named Shadwell. The speaker is Macflanoe, the reigning dunce of literature, and is one of the many double barbs he throws at himself and his subjects. He says, "Shadwell alone my perfect image bears, mature in dullness from his tender years. Shadwell alone of all my sons is he who stands confirmed in full stupidity." In some literary works, the stance can be mixed. The speaker-narrator's relationship to a character or to the reader may shift. In Porter's The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, for example, the point of view moves around from that of a detached observer somewhere in the room — she flicked her wrist neatly out of Dr. Harry's pudgy, careful fingers — to that of a voice coming from inside Granny's mind. Privy to her most private thoughts, Granny's own voice describing herself. "It was good to be strong enough for everything, even if all you made melted and changed and slipped under your hands, so that by the time you finished you almost forgot what you were working for." A shifting, fluid point of view such as Porter's is more characteristic in modern literature, in which the writer seems to feel reality can only be accurately captured from multiple angles, as in a photograph merging two or more different exposures of the same scene. Types of narration. In addition to the degree and kind of involvement suggested by the stance scale, the critical writer can discuss point of view in terms of pronouns. First-person pronouns, I, me, my, we, us, ours, or third person, he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, it, its, and knowledge, limited, only knowing some things, or omniscient, knowing all things, or more than one character would know. We'll now discuss each type of the possible combinations. First-person limited. This type of speaker-narrator is usually a major or minor character, either directly involved in the action or observing at some distance. In Samuel Richardson's epistolary, told in letters, novel Pamela, we learn most of the story through the letters of the heroine, a young poor woman kidnapped by a rich gentleman. The first-person narration of a personal letter directly exposes her feelings and what she knows at a given time. So here was a trap laid for your poor Pamela. I tremble to think of it. Oh, what a scene of wickedness was here laid down for all my wretched life! Black-hearted wretch! How I hate him. A special kind of first-person limited narration is the unreliable speaker-narrator, one whom we are not meant to trust fully. Such a narrator might say something the reader knows to be wrong, make contradictory statements at different points, might exaggerate, or might oversimplify. Such a narrator is Montresor in Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado, a man proud to the point of planning the murder of his friend Fortunato, who once insulted him. While Montresor relates the facts of the story accurately enough, the reader is not meant to rely on his hints that he is justified in his revenge. In addressing the reader as an intimate friend, you who so well know the nature of my soul will not suppose that I gave utterance to a threat. Montresor tries to cajole his audience into a special trust which would approve his diabolical plan. With the unreliable narrator, the author counts on the reader to be a collaborator in discovering the truth. First-person omniscient. Authors don't often use this narrative type, perhaps because most readers would find a speaker narrator using I and knowing everything just about unbelievable and too godlike, however removed from the action. One famous and certainly justified example is the speaker in John Milton's Paradise Lost, who takes on the voice of a poet seeking inspiration from his muse, source of creativity. What in me is dark illumine? What is low, raise and support? That to the highest of this great argument I may assert eternal providence, and justify the ways of God to men. Actually, this speaker realizes his limitations at the start and asks for omniscience, which he presumably receives because the poem continues for 10,565 lines. Third person limited. This kind of narrator functions as an observer with limited knowledge, perhaps knowing only the thoughts and feelings of a principal character, or none at all. Such a narrator is one in Herman Melville's Benito Cereno, reporting and interpreting events mostly from the point of view of Captain Delano, who, as reported, is wondering at the strange behavior of another captain, the title character. The singular alternations of courtesy and ill-breeding in the Spanish captain were unaccountable. He began to regard the stranger's conduct something in the light of an intentional affront. Of course, the idea of lunacy was virtually vacated, but if not a lunatic, what then? Later in the story, the motives for Don Benito's curious behavior become clear. But at this point in the story, the narration is limited to what Delano knows and speculates. Third-person omniscient. Few narrators are so completely all-knowing that they can predict, or would be willing to predict, events before they happen. The term omniscient is usually applied to a speaker-narrator whose understanding goes beneath the surface behavior of virtually all characters, who knows backgrounds, who has a larger sense of the connections of things, and who interprets events and sometimes judges characters. Washington Irving's narrator in the famous sketch Rip Van Winkle speaks with an omniscience that shows a knowledge of how things turn out for everyone after Rip returns from his 20-year sleep. To make a long story short, the company broke up and returned to the more important concerns of the election. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her. She had a snug, well-furnished house and a stout, cheery farmer for a husband, whom Rip collected for one of the urchins that used to climb upon his back. As to Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself, seen leaning against the tree, he was employed to work on the farm, and it is a common wish for all that hen-pecked husbands in the neighborhood, when life hangs heavy on their hands, that they may have a quietening draught out of Rip Van Winkle's flagon. We can now set up the chart to help characterize the point of view in a work by combining attitudes on the stance scale and the types of narration. All the narrative types, first-person limited, first-person omniscient, third-person limited, third-person omniscient, and multiple different kinds, lead to the possible stances from sympathetic and involved, to the center detached and objective, and then to the other end of the spectrum, unsympathetic and hostile. This chart shouldn't be used simplistically or rigidly. Multiple narrative types and different stances in the same work show that point of view is not necessarily fixed, and the critical writer should account for the effects such shifts create in a work. Narrative comment. Narrative type, focal point, and stance influence the reader's experience. A closely related aspect of point of view is narrative comment, and degree to which a narrator-speaker is allowed to say something about what is going on. Speaker-narrators can explain, interpret, speculate on, evaluate, and judge, or they may provide none of these services, depending on stance. But to the degree that the narrator has a voice and character, narrative comment directly affects the reader's own interpretation and judgment. Narrative comment can be as subtle as the choice of words and images as when the narrator in Cheever's The Country's Husband describes the effect of Julia's telling the bickering children to wash up for dinner. This simple announcement, like the war cries of the Scottish chieftains, only refreshes the ferocity of the combatants. The narrative comment here lies in the half-mocking, half-sympathetic contrast of a culturally distant heroic cry with the unheroic clatter that greets Francis Weed on coming home from work. Narrative comment can be much more direct, making the speaker's and or author's values quite clear, as in this statement about the hero of Hawthorne's Ethan Brand, who sacrifices his human feeling for knowledge and power over others. So much for the intellect, but where was the heart? That, indeed, had withered, had contracted, had hardened, had perished. A cold observer looking on mankind as the subject of his experience. One question you need to ask yourself as a critical writer discussing points of view is to what extent narrative comment, when it appears, is helpful or intrusive. Pre-writing about point of view. Focal points is the logical pre-writing technique to generate material for a portfolio on point of view in a particular work. The first question to answer would be, is the narration essentially up close, looking at characters and events in relative detail but in isolation? Inside, looking at the dynamics of one or more characters' inner feelings, or from a panoramic view, seeing characters and events as related in an overall context. A second important pre-writing question is, does the narration mix the focal points, or is it consistent throughout the work? To answer these questions, you would need to write a brief profile of the speaker-narrator, pinpointing narrative type, first-person limited, for example, and stance, sympathetic, hostile, or indifferent. Once you've generated a profile of the speaker-narrator, you can develop your pre-writing with the following questions. How reliable is the speaker-narrator? Does the speaker-narrator change or shift perspective, or is he/she consistent throughout? Is this particular perspective good for telling the story or speaking the poem? Why or why not? Remember, written responses to these questions added to your pre-writing portfolio become the material for the finished essay. Tone. If point of view is the angle or perspective from which a literary work is told, then tone is the actual feeling or attitude that is expressed by point of view. If we think of tone as something that is directed somewhere, we can speak of two potential sources, the author and the speaker-narrator, and three potential targets, characters, audience, and theme or a condition of life. In any given work, there are several possible tonal conditions. 1. The speaker-narrator's attitude may be obviously positive, negative, or neutral. 2. The author's and the speaker-narrator's attitudes may conflict. This usually occurs when the narrator is first-person limited and hostile or unsympathetic. 3. Attitude may shift or blur. Tone is an effect that an author may want to be strong or may want to suppress, but whatever an author's intentions, the reader usually detects an undercurrent of feeling or value in a literary text, a kind of emotional stance behind the voice speaking the words. And those features of the text that create tone are the critical writer's concern. Reading for tone. The vocabulary of tone. While reading, we've all experienced the phenomenon of a voice speaking in the mind. The more skilled a reader is, the more developed that reading voice will be in the sense of having a variety of voices that can be fitted to the material being read. As a critical writer, you need to train your inner ear to listen for the qualities of the voices that authors create and that you recreate. In order to write about literary tone, you need a vocabulary to describe the qualities. The list of tonal words that follows is by no means exhaustive, yet it covers a wide range of attitudes for several different emotions. Formal, majestic, serious, highfalutin, pompous, warm, caring, concerned, sweet, sentimental, syrupy, disapproving, disgusted, scandalized, ironic, mocking, satiric, pleading, begging, prayerful, despairing, helpless, lamenting, angry, enraged, sad, grieving, anguished, tragic, humorous, comic, anxious, frightened, terrified, horrified, thrilled, exhilarated, shocked, surprised. There are important shades of differences between many of these tonal words, so if you're not sure of any, look them up. The greatest facility, though, comes in practice, both in discussions with other readers and in your own writing. You may find that several words describing related emotions are necessary. For example, consider the following passages. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young healthy child well nursed is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roast, baked, or boiled. Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. O powerful western fallen star, O shades of night, O moody tearful night, O great star disappeared, O the black murk that hides the star, O cruel hands that hold me powerless, O helpless soul of me, O harsh surrounding cloud that will not free my soul. Walt Whitman, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. The selection from Swift mocks the knowing American by combining the emphatic seriousness of the observation about children as a food source with the unstated horrified disgust the reader is supposed to feel. Whitman creates a lamenting, helpless tone mixed with fear and a sense of loss. Now that we can name tones and tonal effects, we're ready to discuss just what creates tone in a literary work. Diction and syntax. In part, your profile of a particular speaker-narrator develops from the level of style you sense from diction and syntax. Diction, the choice of words, has a great deal to do with tone. There are so many optional words authors can use to express the same emotion or to describe the same scene that it is no wonder they do so much rewriting. Actually, using different words to describe the same thing can be subtly or drastically change its meaning and how it's perceived by the reader. Consider the effects of word choice in the following selections. Turning on the lights was nice. The kids got close to her and snorted like young cows waiting by the fence at sundown. Lighting the lamps had been beautiful. The children huddled up to her and breathed like little calves waiting at the bars in the twilight. The second selection is from Porter's The Jilting of Granny Weatherall. It is a softer, more gentle tone than the first selection because of the different words. Lighting instead of turning on, beautiful instead of nice, children for kids, little calves for young cows, and twilight for sundown. Diction is often classified as low, middle, or high, slangy, conversational, or formal, or in Walker Gibson's delightful term, tough, sweet, and stuffy. There is no fixed line between these so-called levels of diction, but in terms of word choice, low diction would use primarily single-syllable, easy-to-understand and slang words. Middle would use multi-syllable words in the vocabulary of the average educated adult, and high would use an even greater number of multi-syllable, complex, abstract words not common in everyday usage. The low, middle, and high categories are not determined by word choice alone. Syntax, or the way sentences are constructed, also affect how we hear the speaker-narrator's tone of voice. Short, simple sentences of the subject-verb-direct-object form are more characteristic of the low and middle level of style, while long, complex sentences with embedded clauses and modifiers are associated mostly with the high style and occasionally middle style. Imagery. The kind of images used in a work can have a strong effect on tone. The connotations or associated meanings of the work used to create images often have overtones that express attitude. At the beginning of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, the speaker creates a pleasant atmosphere of rebirth and renovation with images of spring, a time of year in 14th century England when people would renew themselves by making religious pilgrimages. A paraphrase of Chaucer's Middle English in the first 12 lines might read, "When April with his sweet showers has saturated the drought of March and bathed every plant's veins, when the god of wind inspires with his sweet breath the tender buds in every bower and field, and small birds sing that sleep all night with open eye, so does nature touch their hearts. Then do people yearn to go on pilgrimages, and from every shire of England they make their way to Canterbury." The personification of April, the god of wind and nature, along with such positive words as sweet showers bathed, sweet breath, tender buds, sing, and hearts, all create a happy tone, well fitted to the outset of a journey that will provide fascinating characters and wonderfully entertaining tales. When the speaker who expresses the images in a work is a carefully drawn character, those images usually convey the tone of a state of mind. In Shakespeare, That Time of Year, the speaker talks of his age and impending death. The tone throughout suggests sadness, regret for times that are past, perhaps even fear. The tone is elicited by the three major images that structure the sonnet. 1. Yellow leaves hanging on branches, shaking in the cold and ruined churches where birds used to sing. 2. Fading sunset and the approaching night that takes it away. 3. Fire glowing on the ashes of wood that no longer fuels it. The speaker purposely creates a melancholy tone and asks the audience, presumably a lover, to note these images and to use them to strengthen a love whose object will soon be gone. Changes in tone. As a critical writer, you need to be sensitive to changes in tone because they signal important shifts in the speaker, narrator's, or author's attitude towards a character, some conditions of life, or the work's theme. In Shapiro's Autorec, there is a subtle but significant change in tone from the initial horror and physical shock of the spectators, "We are deranged, our throats were tight as tourniquets," to the closing despair of finding any meaning in the accident. This invites the occult mind, cancels our physics with a sneer, and spatters all we know of denouement across the expedient and wicked stones. We usually think of change as a clear movement from one thing to another, as when a feeling of sadness changes to one of joy. But tonal change can involve the author's intentional blurring of attitude, wherein the change occurs in the reader's uncertainty about two or more possible tones. For example, many readers have found the ending to Cheever's The Country Husband to be ambiguous in terms of tone. A miserable cat wanders into the garden, sunk in spiritual and physical discomfort. Tied to its head is a small straw hat, a doll's hat, and it is securely buttoned onto a doll's dress, from the skirts of which protrudes its long, hairy tail. As it walks, it shakes its feet as if it had fallen into water. "Here, kitty, kitty," Julia calls. "Here, kitty, here, poor kitty." But the cat gives her a skeptical look and stumbles away in its skirts. The last to come is Jupiter. He prances through the tomato vines, holding in his generous mouth the remains of an evening slipper. Then it is dark. It is a night where kings in golden suits ride elephants over the mountains. The closing allusion to the heroic figure of Hannibal crossing the Alps should not surprise the reader. Throughout the story, the narrator has injected references to heroes and heroines of history and classical mythology, with the effects of putting Shady Hill and Francis Weed's romantic yearnings into ironic contrast with epic character and deeds. But what is the attitude at the end, where Cheever juxtaposes a slipper in a dog's mouth with a knight reminiscent of a legendary Carthaginian general? Some readers sense a mocking tone here, highlighting the absurdity of such a connection in modern suburbia, while others sense a more tolerant tone of sympathy for the foibles of Shady Hill. Whatever each reader's impression of the tone, such ambiguity is not a defect. It is part of Cheever's art to leave us unsettled. Whether tonal change is clear, moving sharply from one different attitude to another, or blurred, your critical assessment should deal with the effect of such changes on the reader's experience and the author's purpose. If experience and purpose complement one another, then the tone is probably working well. If experience and purpose clash, then there may be a problem. Pre-writing about tone. The thought pattern classification is most useful for pre-writing about tone. In a simple two-step process, you first list all the words and images in a poem, passage of prose, or dialogue that expresses attitude and emotion. Second, you group those particular words and images under the appropriate tonal headings. To illustrate, read the following passage from William Wordsworth, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, in which he returns to a favorite boyhood place, the River Wye, and speaks to it. "How oft, in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir, unprofitable, and fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, O Sylvan, why? How often has my spirit turned to thee, and now, with gleams of half-extinguished thought, the picture of my mind revives again, and so I dare to hope." Here are the key words and images from the passage, grouped by classification into related tonal words. Despair, anxiousness, weariness. Darkness, joyless, fretful, unprofitable, fever, hung on the beatings of my heart. Hope, expectation, longing include, O Sylvan, why, my spirit turned to thee, gleams of half-extinguished thought, revives hope. This material would become part of the pre-writing portfolio. Sample essay. The sample essay that follows deals with the point of view and tone in Thomas's Fern Hill. The happy, dying voice in Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill. Fern Hill is both a celebration of joyous boyhood and a sad reflection on the loss of youth. Dylan Thomas manages a difficult balancing act in expressing believable tones of innocent joy and longing regret for what some of us lose completely and others hold on to. He makes these contrasting attitudes believable by using a first-person speaker whose point of view subtly changes from the self-centered limited knowledge of a boy to the greater understanding of a mature man. For the first 4 stanzas, the tone is pure joy, the delight of a young boy growing up in the country. All of the adjectives describing the emotions and the images of playing express youthful innocence. I was young and easy, happy as the grass was green. Honored, I was prince, I was green and carefree. Even his environment takes on the qualities of beauty and happiness he sees everywhere. The happy yard, the calves sang to my horn, it was air and playing lovely and watery and fire green as grass. The feeling expressed by tonal words and images flows freely between speaker and setting. Throughout the first 4 stanzas, even though spoken in the past tense from a distant perspective, the voice is that of the boy, often rushing, breathless with excitement, as when he exclaims, "All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay, fields high as the house," and later, "My wishes raced through the horse-high hay." In his attitude of unrestrained joy, there is a foundation of safety. The boy's fantastic dream of the farm, flying through the night with owls, birds, and flashing horses, always returns to normal the next morning. And then, to awake in the farm like a wanderer white with dew, come back with bird on his shoulders, it was all shining. So long as there is certainty and the farm comes back after each night's dream ride, the happiness will last. But of course we know, even before being told by the speaker that this state will not last, hints of the inevitable shift in tone come as early as the first stanza, when time is personified as being who permits the boy to feel so free. "Time, let me hail and climb." In the second stanza, "Time, let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means." A gift from such a being does not last. As the speaker first directly says in the 5th stanza, "Time allows in all his tuneful turning so few in such mornings, before the children green and golden follow him out of grace." This Pied Piper takes away what he gives. The words and images of the 6th and final stanza represent an attitude of regretful loss at the process of aging that works even as the boy revels in the life of the farm. With the insight of age, the speaker loses the farm, and he wakes to the farm forever fled from the childless land. What saves the poem from despair at the end is knowing that the speaker who has lost the fact of his wonderful youth can still recreate the feel of it in his poem or song. "Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea." Through carefully chosen tonal words and images of joy and loss, Thomas recreates the innocence and its passing. Though his speaker looks back nostalgically on his boyhood, his voice can still capture the exuberance without getting too sweet, and now the sense of regret without complete bitterness. Chapter 9. Discovering a Tentative Thesis. In part 1 of this text, we discussed the steps that precede the writing of a literary essay. We talked about reading literature and reacting to what you read, and we discussed the purpose behind reading and writing about literature. We also reviewed and practiced a number of ways, both formal and informal, to generate ideas that you might later include in your essay. And to help you think critically, we defined and explored the roles of various literary elements. Now in part 2, we'll look at the actual crafting of a literary essay. In these chapters, we'll discuss what a literary thesis is and how to discover and shape one. How to organize your essay, how to develop your introduction, middle paragraphs, and conclusion using appropriate literary evidence, how to avoid logical pitfalls, and finally, how to revise and edit your work to make it as polished as possible. The thesis. It may be called the controlling idea, the main idea, the central idea, the main point, the focal point, the focus, the direction of your essay, the thesis statement, or simply the thesis. Regardless of what it is called, the idea embodied in this central sentence, a thesis cannot be a word or phrase, is the kernel from which your essay takes form and grows. Like a cell with its own genetic coding, a thesis will direct the shape of your work, suggesting the substance of the middle paragraphs in your essay. The thesis will also raise certain expectations in your readers, who will assume you'll follow your plan through. Because it's the idea from which the essay grows, the thesis is usually found in the introduction, not in the later parts of the essay. An essay without a thesis will likely seem a random collection of thoughts, which the reader then tries, sometimes unsuccessfully, to put together into a meaningful whole. As good writers, we strive to control the expression of our thoughts so that our meaning is clear to our audience. The basis of this control is the thesis. The literary thesis. The literary thesis, like all theses, makes a statement which is not at once obvious to the audience. The statement requires explanation before the reader will understand and be persuaded to accept it. The literary thesis, of course, makes a statement about a work of literature. The intention of the writer is to persuade the reader to accept this statement by presenting and discussing evidence from the story, poem, or play. The thesis should not be a question. It should be an assertion. It frequently focuses on the writer's craft, making clear the purpose of the work and how the author achieves his or her purpose. The interaction of the literary element in a work, or the analysis of one particular element and how it is used. While there are many kinds of assertions which a writer can make about literature, we will look at 3 types of thesis statements which are progressively more complex and challenging. There are 1, the static or simple thesis, 2, the dynamic thesis, and 3, the integrated thesis. Briefly, the static thesis focuses on one literary element with the purpose of identifying that element and defining and describing it further. The dynamic thesis still focuses on one literary element, but shows how it evolves or alters in the course of the work. The integrated thesis shows interaction between two or more literary elements for a stated purpose. This last type of thesis requires the writer not only to identify the parts and to see how they work, but also to explain why they work and for what purpose they exist. Let's use a popular literary tale, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and develop these three types of thesis statements about it. As you might recall, the gentle but inquisitive Dr. Jekyll mixes a potion which, when he drinks, allows his baser, more animalistic nature to come to the surface, and thus he becomes the murderous Mr. Hyde. If we were to describe the character of Dr. Jekyll as we encounter him in any segment of the story, we might say, Dr. Jekyll is a kind and generous person who values scientific knowledge and discovery. This is a static thesis. It isolates Dr. Jekyll and identifies him as a man with certain qualities. The essay which follows from this thesis, we expect, will further describe him and provide evidence of his kindness, generosity, and desire for knowledge. However, we can see that this static thesis is very limited. It accounts for only part of Dr. Jekyll's personality. It does not try to take into account the changes that occur in Dr. Jekyll's personality in the course of the story. A dynamic thesis would do just that. It would take into account the changes that occur in Dr. Jekyll's character over a period of time. The kind, generous, and intellectual Dr. Jekyll is periodically and then finally overpowered by his brutal, animalistic other self, Mr. Hyde. This thesis is more complete than the static thesis, but it does not account for the reason, the meaning behind this change in Dr. Jekyll's character. In forming an integrated thesis, we would try to understand the change in Dr. Jekyll's character and state a purpose or reason for this transformation, a reason which helps us to understand the whole story. Through the transformation of kind, intellectual Dr. Jekyll into the deformed, brutal Mr. Hyde, Stevenson points out the dangers of humans interfering with nature. Or through the transformation of Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde, Stevenson explores the delicate balance between the kind-hearted intellectual and the brutal animal, the double nature which every human being shares. The change in Dr. Jekyll, therefore, has a purpose. It illustrates an idea that manipulating nature may have unknown and dangerous consequences, or that human beings are both animalistic and intellectual, a balance which Dr. Jekyll upsets. The first thesis is not very ambitious. It needs little proof. The second thesis is more ambitious than the first, but the last is the most challenging and perceptive because it goes beyond description in attempting to understand and not just record the changes in Dr. Jekyll's character, connecting this character with an idea, a theme, to see a purpose behind his transformation. The static thesis. When our main point consists of identifying and describing a literary element such as a character, imagery, setting, structure, point of view, or tone, theme will be dealt with in this section on the integrated thesis, we have a static thesis. Consider the following examples. 1. In Cheever's The Country Husband, Francis Weed is a character who is unable to communicate. Weed is identified as a character with a certain quality. 2. Robinson Jeffers compares poets to stonecutters in To the Stonecutters. The central metaphor of this poem is identified. 3. William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, the house is seen as ancient and out of place in the changing southern neighborhood. Setting is identified as a house with certain qualities. 4. The Mill is formally written in 8-line stanzas with rhyme and iambic tetrameter lines. The structure of the poem is identified. 5. The jilting of Granny Weatherall is told from Granny's disoriented point of view. Point of view is identified and described. The tone, for 6, the tone of Widow's Lament in Springtime is melancholy. The tone is identified. Each of these thesis statements might be developed further through description and evidence. How do we know Francis Weed is unable to communicate, and what do we mean by this assertion? What similarities does Jeffers discuss in his comparison of poets and stonecutters? What is ancient and out of place about the house in A Rose for Emily? What more do we know about the structure of the mill? Can we further describe the meter and rhyme? How do we know Granny is telling the story, and how does she tell it? How can we further describe the widow's tone? You can see that once you've answered these questions fully, any additional comments would digress from the thesis. None of these thesis statements would be appropriate for a long essay because the focus of the statements is very limited. Each calls for identification and description, with no discussion of purpose. A common type of static thesis occurs in the character sketch, which may vary in length depending on the number of personality traits the writer decides to discuss. The static thesis particularly suits a literary element that is unusual and therefore merits being singled out for description. The dynamic thesis. The dynamic thesis has, at its core, a change noted in a literary element as the work progresses. The character changes, the setting changes, the tone changes, and so on. This type of thesis is most common in essays which focus on characterization, although it is certainly possible in essays which examine change in imagery, setting, structure, point of view, and tone. Theme is usually consistent throughout a work, so it is unlikely to become the subject of a dynamic thesis. In the following examples, the italicized words signal a dynamic thesis. 1. Francis Weed in The Country Husband changes from a man who conforms to the values of Shady Hill to one who challenges those values. Character. 2. In Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach, the sea imagery dominates the first 3 stanzas, while the imagery in the last stanza focuses on the confused land. Imagery. 3. The house in Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher deteriorates until it falls apart in the chaos of the storm at the end. Setting. 4. In Emerson's poem Hamatreya, the long prose-like lines yield to short chant-like lines when the earth speaks. Structure. 5. The point of view in J.D. Salinger's Fresme with Love and Squalor shifts from first person to third person limited, although the entire story is told by Sergeant X. Point of view. 6. The tone of The Mill changes from anxiety and anticipation to desperate resignation. Tone. These types of thesis will require more discussion than the static thesis, since more than one part of the literary work must be analyzed. Typically, your essay will identify and describe a literary element, character, imagery, setting, point of view, or tone, as it appears at the beginning of the work, and as it appears at the end of work, noting as many changes in between as necessary. The essay that evolves from this type of thesis will probably rely heavily on comparison as a means of organization, and as a mode of paragraph development, a technique we'll discuss in chapters 10 and 12. The integrated thesis. In an integrated thesis, we try to explain the interaction between parts of a literary work. The point made by this type of thesis is not just that the literary elements exist or change, but that they are meaningful in some way, and that they help fulfill the author's purpose. In this treatment, we look at character, imagery, setting, structure, point of view, or tone, not in themselves, but as a way of understanding the whole work. We deliberately left theme out of our discussion of the static thesis because theme, as you recall from chapter 3, is the purpose of the work. When we talk about theme, we are automatically talking about the whole work. A thesis which focuses on theme, therefore, integrates other literary elements into the discussion, since theme is revealed through the interplay of the other elements. One way to form an integrated thesis is to state the relationship between one or more elements and the theme of the work. Consider the following questions. What is the author's purpose, and how does he or she achieve this purpose? How does character reveal the theme? Is there a pattern of images or symbols which form a thematic focus? Does the setting complement the theme? How does the structure serve the author's purpose? How does the point of view affect the theme? Does the tone complement the theme? If you're able to answer one of these questions in relation to a specific work, then you'll have an integrated thesis. In addition to relating one or more literary elements to the theme of the work, an integrated thesis can relate 2 or more literary elements to each other without directly including theme. Consider the following questions. How does the setting reveal character? Setting and character. How does the setting create a moon which ironically contrasts with the action? Setting, tone, plot. How does point of view affect characterization? Point of view, character. How does point of view affect structure? Point of view, structure. How does point of view affect tone? Point of view, tone. There are obviously other combinations, but the ones we've listed are fairly common. We include a more extensive list of thesis questions at the end of this chapter. There is still another way to arrive at an integrated thesis. You can convert a static or dynamic thesis into an integrated thesis by including a discussion of the author's purpose. Why is this character, setting, or other element portrayed in this manner? Why do the images, structure, and so on change? The following thesis statements are revisions of some of those given as examples of static and dynamic statements. A purpose or an effect of the literary elements has been added in italics to each thesis. Note the differences. Robinson Jeffers to the stone cutters. Jeffers compares poems to stones and poets to stone cutters in an effort to justify the existence of poetry despite its impermanence and to explain poetry's purpose. Imagery and theme are connected. 2. William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. Miss Emily's character is reflected in her house, a deteriorated structure which was once elegant and which is now sadly out of place. The purpose of the setting is to tell us about the character. Edwin Arlington Robinson's The Mill. The sing-song rhyme and meter of The Mill are jarring in a serious poem which shows the desperation of 2 characters who choose suicide rather than face a meaningless life. Structure, tone, and theme are joined in this thesis. 4. Catherine Ann Porter's The Jilting of Granny Weatherall. Because the story is told by Granny, who is disoriented and dying, it moves freely from reminiscences to hallucinations to physical sensations and reactions to her immediate environment. Point of view and structure are connected. William Carlos Williams's The Widow's Lament in Springtime. Ironically, through images of spring, Williams creates a melancholy tone, as the widow is reminded of death and loneliness. Tone, imagery, and theme are united in this thesis. Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. The imagery changes focus from sea to land as the narrator turns from a consideration of the world's problems to a consideration of his present plight. Imagery is connected to plot and structure. Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. The progressive deterioration of the House of Usher parallels the mental and physical deterioration of the Usher family. Setting and character are connected. Edwin Arlington Robinson's The Mill. The tone changes from anxiety and anticipation to desperate resignation as the wife, who had been waiting for the miller's return, discovers her husband's suicide and then decides to take her own life. Tone is seen as paralleling plot. J.D. Salinger's For Esme with Love and Squalor. The point of view shifts from first person to third person, even though Sergeant X continues to narrate the story, because he is so psychologically wounded that it becomes painful for him to talk about it himself personally. Thesis joins point of view and characterization. The essays which would result from these thesis statements would be complex, uniting a number of different literary elements. For example, the essay evolving from thesis number 4 would not only describe Granny's point of view, but would show its effects on the structure of the story. The essay would discuss each of the categories outlined, reminiscences, hallucinations, physical sensations, and reactions to her environment, and show why they are a part of Granny's experiences at the time of her death, and how they are connected to each other as the story is structured. The essay evolving from thesis number 8 would not only describe the change in tone in the mill, but would explain the reasons for this change. The essay would trace the tone through the 3 stanzas, linking it with the development of the plot and in each of the stanzas, as well as showing what words or images carry the tone. The integrated thesis can serve as the basis for a brief or an extensive discussion of a work. It can bring into focus 2 or more literary elements at the same time, and it will allow you not only to analyze a work showing its parts, but to synthesize it as well, to fit the parts of the work back together with your interpretation. It is a challenging and creative type of writing, and the most comprehensive of the 3 types we've reviewed. You may have occasion to use a static or dynamic thesis, but the integrated thesis is the hallmark of a more complete understanding of literature. The 2-step thesis. The thesis contains only the kernel of an essay, implying but not necessarily stating all the supporting points which will be developed in the middle paragraphs. The thesis is most effective when it is clear and compact, a statement that the audience might hold in mind while reading the essay or might easily refer to if the need arises. If the thesis is not made clear for your readers, they'll have to manufacture one for themselves from the clues you've dropped or the points you've made in the body of the essay. The writer takes a chance when the thesis isn't clearly and concisely stated, risking many interpretations and misinterpretations of the essay, since the thesis that each reader deduces will depend on the reader's skill and the clarity of the essay's organization. The writer might also frustrate a part of the audience who may not want to put together the point for themselves, or who cannot find the link between the ideas in the essay. For these reasons, the thesis is frequently a sentence, not a paragraph, though it may be found in an introductory paragraph. But sometimes our ideas are so complex, or we join so many different ideas in our thesis, that to make it one sentence would be awkward. The sentence would be so long and complicated that clarity would be sacrificed. In such circumstances, a 2-sentence thesis can be helpful. The 2-sentence thesis is especially suited to a literary essay if you want to include not only your main point, but also the major divisions of your essay. The first sentence would state the main point. The second sentence would list the aspects of the work to be considered in the essay. Major point plus major aspects equal 2-step thesis. Look at the following examples. A. In The Country Husband, a near brush with death causes Francis Weed to change his attitude toward Shady Hill. This change is especially evident in his feelings for Anne Murchison and in his treatment of Mrs. Wrightson and Julia. On Snake, Lawrence's snake is more than a simple animal. It represents at the same time evil, royalty, and a hidden part of man. Lawrence makes these symbolic meanings clear through images of the underworld, through the snake's demeanor, and through the interaction between the narrator and the snake. In examples A and B above, the first sentence is the thesis. The second sentence explains the major divisions or aspects to be discussed in the essay. You'll notice that the 2-step thesis is a mini outline of your essay. The essay evolving from thesis A would have at least 3 middle sections. 1, a section discussing Francis's feelings for Anne Murchison, how these feelings are connected to the plane crash, and how they reflect Francis's new attitude. 2, a second section discussing how Francis's treatment of Mrs. Wrightson shows that he has changed, and again, how this change is related to the plane crash. Third, a third section detailing Francis's relationship to Julia, how it has changed, and how this change is related to the plane crash. The writer of this essay may feel that it is desirable to begin with a discussion of the plane crash to show how and why it affected Francis, and then to proceed to the three areas in which the change is most evident. All these ideas are part of this two-step thesis. The essay evolving from Thesis B might be even more complex. It could evolve into an essay with 3 to 9 middle sections. The three symbolic meanings would each require a section, and each of the three elements in sentence 2 might be related to one or more of the symbolic meanings. So we might have an essay whose middle section looks like this. A. The snake is evil. 3 parts, 3 paragraphs. Images of the underworld prove this point would be paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 is the snake's demeanor proves this point. And the third paragraph would be the interaction between narrator and snake proves this point. The next section, B, the snake is royal, might have 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, images of the underworld prove this point. 2, the snake's demeanor proves this point. And 3, the interaction between narrator and the snake proves this point. And the final section, C, the snake is a hidden part of man, could have 3 paragraphs. The first one being, images of the underworld prove this point. 2, the snake's demeanor proves this point. 3, the interaction between narrator and snake proves this point. Or perhaps the writer intends to relate only one aspect in the second sentence to each symbolic meaning in the first sentence. Then the middle section would look like this. A, the snake is evil, as shown by the images of the underworld. B, the snake is royal, as shown by the snake's demeanor. C, the snake is a hidden part of man, as shown by the interaction between the narrator and the snake. Such an outline might be developed by only 3 middle paragraphs, or the writer might expand the treatment depending on the amount of development each point needs. In brief, then, the two-step thesis serves to present not only the main idea, but also the major divisions in the middle section of the essay, and, in doing so, the two-step thesis helps structure the body of the essay. The comparative thesis. Ezra Pound, in a book called ABC of Reading, suggests that students of literature should become more like biologists in carefully examining and comparing specimens. There is no doubt that we can learn a great deal through comparison. When we compare 2 works, we look at them in light of each other and will notice features which we might have missed if we'd looked at each work independently. For example, when comparing Robinson's The Mill to Williams's The Widow's Lament in Springtime, we note obvious differences in form, which might lead us to question which works better. Robinson's poem is highly structured, while Williams's is free verse. We might consider what advantage each poet gains by his choice of form. Also, Williams's poem has a first-person narrator. A third party outside the disaster narrates Robinson's poem. The difference in narration affects the tone of each work. The narrative perspective and its effects might not be as noticeable if the 2 poems were considered separately. By comparing these works, we learn about both poems. Comparison poses special problems for the critical writer. The number of elements which will have to be united in a thesis will increase twofold. Not only will you have to consider similarities between 2 or more works, but you will also need to cite some differences. After all, the works are not identical. The task is challenging, but worth the time and effort. The following guidelines are intended to help you shape a thesis for an essay comparing 2 works of literature. 1. Choose 2 works which have a significant common ground. A good comparison is based on well-chosen works, which provide a range of important similarities and differences. Imagine trying to compare Thomas's Fern Hill and Robinson's The Mill. You'd have a long list of differences, but what would be the point of comparing them? What is their common ground and reason for bringing them together? You might as well compare turnips to coffins. For a comparison to be meaningful, there should be a good reason for bringing the works together. 2. Limit the scope of your comparison and choose a focus. Most likely, you won't be able to include every similarity and difference you notice. In order for your essay to be unified and not merely a discussion of random similarities and differences, you need to choose a major similarity or a major difference as your focus. All other points should be related to this principal focus. In addition, you should adjust the number of points you intend to discuss to suit the scope of your paper. In a short essay, you may only want to touch upon one important similarity and difference. In longer essays, you may include many similarities and differences. 3. Try to group the points of comparison so that the thesis is not unwieldy. Not every similarity or difference discussed in the essay needs to be specifically stated in the thesis, but each point should be implied in the thesis. 4. The points you cover should apply to both literary works, or your essay will be unbalanced. If you choose an aspect of one work while the other totally lacks, you can only discuss one work. 5. Consider a subordinate clause to set off a similarity or a difference from the main point in a single-sentence thesis. Although, while, despite, and even though are useful conjunctions to begin a clause which shows a contrast. See pages 230 to 231 for a discussion of subordinate clauses. 6. Use the two-step thesis when you have too many ideas for one sentence. A comparative thesis lends itself to easy division into similarities and differences. Similarities plus differences equal two-step comparative thesis. Before we look at some examples of comparative thesis statements, let's see how one pre-writing technique, brainstorming, can be an invaluable tool in generating ideas for a comparison essay and an aid in finding a thesis. The technique can be applied to comparison topics by making a list of any similarities and differences you find in two literary works. The following is the result of a brainstorming exercise on The Vacuum and The Widow's Lament in Springtime. Similarities. 1. Narrators of poems have lost a spouse. 2. Both narrators feel sad. 3. Both are reminded of the dead person by other things. Differences. 4. Vacuum, male narrator. Widow, female narrator. 5. Vacuum, images of mechanical vacuum, dirt, house cleaning. Widow, images of flowers, fire, nature. 6. Vacuum, anger. Widow, no anger, just depression. 7. Vacuum, narrator goes on living. Widow, narrator wants to die. 8. Vacuum, long lines. Widow, short lines. After generating as many ideas as possible, select only the points which seem to fit together, given the criteria previously mentioned, and formulate a thesis which adequately conveys these points. There will probably be more than one thesis possible for any brainstorming list. A well-constructed comparative thesis will virtually organize your essay for you. Let's look at a few examples. Thesis A was derived from the brainstorming exercise we've just discussed. A. Comparison of Nemirov's The Vacuum and Williams's The Widow's Lament in Springtime. Thesis. Although different objects remind the narrators of their grief, they both feel saddened by the loss of a spouse and have difficulty continuing with their own lives. The Vacuum and The Widow's Lament in Springtime are logical choices for comparison because their subjects are so similar. The grief experienced by those who lose a loved one, particularly a spouse. This writer has limited the focus to the similarities and differences in the narrator's experiences, the cause of the grief, the objects that remind the narrators of the loss, and the narrator's reaction to the loss. Points 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7 from the brainstorming list are joined in this thesis. However, points 6 and 7 are implied rather than stated in detail. In developing the plan laid out by the thesis, the writer may very well discuss the differences in the endings of the poems. Nemirov's narrator is angry, but still has a will to live. Williams's narrator wants to die. The point is implied in a discussion of the narrator's difficulty continuing with their own lives, mentioned in the thesis. There is no point to cluttering the thesis by specifying a subdivision of a point already mentioned. This thesis also mentions a major difference between the two works in a subordinate clause beginning the sentence. The statement covers 3 points, though there certainly may be subdivisions which occur in the development of the points. The points seem balanced and applicable to both poems. B. Comparison of Not Marble Nor the Gilded Monuments by William Shakespeare and To the Stonecutters by Robinson Jeffers. Thesis. By comparing poems with monuments, each author shows that a poet's work endures over time. However, Shakespeare is more confident than Jeffers that his work will survive. Both poems are about poetry and are suitable for comparison. The focus of the comparison is the theme, that poems will last a long time. The 2 other aspects covered relate to this theme. Both poets use similar imagery to show a poem's longevity, and both poets feel a different degree of confidence, tone, about the survival of their work. The discussion will be balanced. Notice how each of the previous thesis statements avoids including points which do not relate to the chosen focus. For example, the structure of the 2 poems in each case is easily comparable, but unless it can be related to the rest of the discussion, it would be a digression in the essay. None of these writers is able to fit a comparison of structure into the focus, although such a comparison might be possible with other topics. The next thesis has a problem with focus and balance. Comparison of Pound's The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter, and Williams's The Widow's Lament in Springtime. Thesis. Although both poems are about a woman's loneliness due to the absence of her husband, they differ in that Pound's poem will give us some background, and Pound's narrator has some hope that she will see her husband again, while Williams's narrator has no hope. The problematic point in this thesis is Pound's poem gives us some background. After the writer says that William's poem gives no background, what is there left to say about Williams's poem? The writer can't compare the childhood or early marriage of Pound's narrator with that of Williams's widow because Williams does not provide us with any details about these parts of the widow's life. The background discussion will involve only one poem. In addition, while the points about loneliness and hope seem to fit together nicely, how does background relate to the focus the writer chooses? the loneliness a woman feels due to the absence of her husband? And finally, couldn't the last 2 points, Pound's narrator has some hope that she will see her husband again, while Williams's narrator has no hope, be stated more concisely? The elaboration should be saved for the development of this point in the middle paragraph. The next 2 thesis statements present even more of a problem than thesis C, which does have a focus, although the writer strays from it. We haven't included the titles of works on which these essays were written because, as you'll see, it really doesn't matter. Thesis, for D. The purpose of this essay will be to show how the 2 poets, while dealing with the same subject, use different structures, tones, and images to convey different themes. E. Thesis. Although the poems are similar in their subjects and their structures, the poems are different in their themes, tones, and images. Neither of these thesis statements has a focus of comparison. The points are so vague that they can be applied to almost any 2 literary works. A laundry list thesis like D or E will likely result in an essay whose points are randomly chosen. And even if the writer is able to relate all these literary concepts to one idea, the reader will still have to decipher the idea from the middle paragraphs because this type of thesis gives no direction at all. Thesis problems. The vague thesis. A vague thesis can weaken more than a comparative essay. It can be a serious problem in any type of writing. A vague literary thesis is characterized by unspecified key terms which might be applied to any work of literature and which should instead be defined for the specific works under consideration. There are, of course, degrees of vagueness. In general, you should make the key terms in your thesis as specific as the ideas discussed in your essay will allow. Take the following thesis from an essay on Nemirov's The Vacuum. Thesis. The narrator's attitude toward the death of his woman is reflected through the use of imagery. There are 2 key terms left undefined in this thesis, attitude and imagery. The writer should try to specify what attitude is revealed and what images will be discussed. Compare this revision to the original thesis. The narrator's sorrow and anger at his woman's death is revealed through his personification of the vacuum cleaner. The tone, attitude, and imagery in the revised thesis are not left as generalizations but are taken from the poem. The attitude is sorrow and anger. The imagery is a personified vacuum cleaner. After you have a thesis, take a clear look at the key terms. If you find any that can be made more specific, do so. The factual thesis. We should briefly mention one other thesis problem, the thesis that is too limited. In one sense, the static thesis discussed earlier may fall into this category if it is too narrow to support an entire essay, but of even greater concern are statements that appear as thesis statements but are really statements of fact, plot details. For example, the writer who sets out to show that Francis Weed in The Country Husband dreams of having an affair with a babysitter will soon find there is nothing to prove. There is no need to demonstrate this point. It is stated in the story. The writer is not elaborating on the use of literary elements or showing a relationship between elements or discussing the purpose of the work. The same problem occurs in an essay whose thesis is the narrator of D.H. Lawrence's Snake throws a log at the retreating animal. The fact is stated in the poem. It doesn't require an essay to prove it. Remember, in order to sustain an essay, a thesis must be a point which needs explanation and proof. If it is obvious to the reader, there's no point in writing an essay about it. From pre-writing to a thesis. In part 1 of this text, we suggested several activities that might be helpful in generating ideas so that you might find a thesis and construct a well-developed essay. Too frequently, writers will start out by trying to come up with an immediate thesis before exploring their ideas in pre-writing activities. The results are often poorly developed, vaguely conceived essays. Now that you have a good idea of what a thesis is, let's turn to your pre-writing portfolio and see how you might go about discovering a thesis of your own. Sometimes in the very act of writing your journal or free writing or using formal pre-writing methods, a thesis will become obvious. You'll simply know what you want to prove. Look, for example, at the following journal entries on the poem Christ Climbed Down by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. April 8. At first, reading the poem stirred up feelings of guilt. Most of the trappings of our modern Christmas celebration are recognizable. The poem contrasts Christ's humble birth and cruel death with the modern materialistic frenzy of our American holiday season. April 9. Christ's tree, the cross, is bare, as compared with the traditional Christmas tree, which is gaudy and fragile. The second stanza points out not only the overblown tradition of the Christmas tree, but also the artificiality of today's evergreen. The next stanza further undermines current religious symbols and practices. The Bible is sold instead of given by a man in a Cadillac. The three kings are spokesmen for booze. April 10. Structure is important in this poem. The simplicity of the first 4 lines of each stanza, which refer to Christ, contrast with the intricate descriptions in the rest of the stanza, similar to the contrast of Christ's life with our own. April 11th. Santa Claus doesn't fare too well in stanza 4. The poem suggests that he has been elevated to sainthood, yet he is portrayed as an obnoxious fake, also bearing gifts that are from a very status-conscious department store. April 12th. I thought of the poem as a whole today. There's so much in the poem that one could discuss it for a week. The first stanza introduces the theme, stanzas 2 through 5 elaborate on the theme, and the last stanza makes me wonder what the consequences of the materialism surrounding Christmas will be. We've underlined 3 possible thesis statements which are apparent in this writer's journal. Of course, they would have to be reworded slightly to make them more precise and polished, but the thesis ideas are there from the beginning of this writer's exploration of the poem. The thesis which he put together for an essay includes ideas mentioned in the entries from April 8th, 9th, and 11th. Thesis. In the poem Christ Climbed Down, Ferlinghetti contrasts Christ's humility with the materialistic frenzy of the modern Christmas holiday by using repetitive and contrasting images and ironic description of our semi-religious traditions. Certainly, the writer will be able to use the other ideas mentioned in his journal to fill out his essay. Of the 3 formal pre-writing methods illustrated in Part 1, thought pattern questions seem to yield more or less complete thesis statements. We'll discuss these patterns and the thesis statements which lead to essays using classification, definition, comparison, and analysis in the next chapter. For now, it will suffice to say that the following thought pattern questions can help you find a thesis for your essay. What kinds of blank does the author use to blank? Classification. What does X mean in the story, play, or poem? Definition. How do X and Y compare and contrast? Comparison. What are the results of or effects of X? Analysis. How did X happen, or what caused X? Analysis. The answer to these questions may be a thesis in the rough that needs only to be reworked slightly. It is unlikely that the thesis will present itself full-blown in your pre-writing activities, so you'll have to review what you've written to discover a focus. It will undoubtedly take some practice for you to recognize patterns, possible topics, and thesis statements. You'll probably be forming your thesis out of meaningful fragments drawn from your pre-writing portfolio. We'd like to suggest a few steps to help you begin to organize your thoughts. 1. Review. Read through your pre-writing portfolio to get an overview of your reactions. 2. Sift. Go back and underline parts which seem to have potential for critical writing. Circle important words. 3. Group ideas. Try to discover some patterns in your observations. Do you find yourself talking about theme as the student who wrote about the journal entry on Christ Climbed Down did? Do you make any observations about character, setting, imagery, point of view, tone, or structure? Are there any other ways you can classify the material? Perhaps there are some recurring words or thoughts. 4. Labeling ideas. Label your underlined thoughts by category, either relating them to specific ideas or to literary elements. You may have many different labels. Make a list of your labels. These are the potential topics from which your essay will evolve. If you've been assigned a topic, you may begin at this point by analyzing the language of the topic for key ideas, such as discuss the identity crisis, and require writing strategies such as compare and contrast. 5. Question. After deciding on your topic, perhaps you'll want to try more than one. Formulate some questions which will help you put your fragmentary thoughts into a thesis statement. Use a list of questions at the end of this section if it helps point you towards a thesis. If you've been assigned a topic, turn the topic into one or more related questions, or you may find some questions in the list at the end of this section which pertain to your topic. 6. Answer. After you've sifted through your pre-writing material for clues, answer your questions in writing. You might also want to look back at the literary work. 7. Formulate a tentative thesis from your answers. Refine your thesis so that it is not vague or narrow. That sounds like a lot of steps, but they can be done quickly and will become automatic for you before long. In fact, steps 2, 3, and 4 can be done almost simultaneously, or as you underline, you can label and later group your thoughts. These are suggested activities, and you, of course, should adapt them so that they work for you. The material doesn't become part of your thesis might help you to develop the middle paragraphs of your essay, so collect all of your early written impressions in your portfolio. Following is a list of thesis questions for you to draw on after you discover what your general topic is. Indicated in the parentheses is the type of thesis the question is likely to yield. Many of the questions overlap one another. Choose only ones that are appropriate for your topic. Character. How would you describe the character? Static thesis. Does the character reveal the meaning of the work? In what ways? Integrated thesis. What technique does the author use to reveal the character? Integrated thesis. Can the character be classified? Static thesis. Is there a purpose to including 2 or more character classifications in the work? Integrated thesis. Does the character change? Dynamic thesis. How does the character's change relate to the author's overall purpose? Theme. Integrated thesis. Are any of the characters symbolic? Integrated thesis. Theme. What idea does the work develop, and how is the idea made clear? Integrated thesis. What is the purpose of the work, and how is that purpose achieved? Integrated thesis. Imagery and symbolism. Can you identify an important image or a pattern of images? Static thesis. Is there an image or a pattern of images which help convey the purpose of the work or a central idea? Integrated thesis. Is there an image or a pattern of images which help portray a character? Integrated thesis. Is there an image or pattern of images which help convey the tone? Integrated thesis. Does the imagery change in the course of the work? Dynamic thesis. Is there a purpose to the change in the imagery? Integrated thesis. Are there any symbols which reveal the character? Integrated thesis. Are there any symbols which reveal the theme? Integrated thesis. Setting. What is the setting? Static thesis. Does the setting help convey the theme? Integrated thesis. Does the setting help portray a character? Integrated thesis. What mood does the setting create? Static thesis. Does the setting create a mood which complements or ironically contrasts with the action? Integrated thesis. Does the setting change? Dynamic thesis. What is the purpose of the change in setting? How does the change relate to theme or character? Integrated thesis. Is the setting symbolic? Integrated thesis. Structure. What is the structure of the work? Static thesis. How does the structure of the work serve the author's purpose? Integrated thesis. If the story, play, or poem is not told chronologically, what is the purpose behind the arrangement of events in the work? Integrated thesis. What is the rationale between the divisions in a story, play, or poem? Integrated thesis. How is the conclusion foreshadowed, prepared for by the author? Integrated thesis. Point of view. What is the point of view? Static thesis. What are the advantages and or disadvantages to the point of view the author chose? Integrated thesis. How does the point of view affect the theme of the work? Integrated thesis. How does the point of view affect the characterization of the work? Integrated thesis. How does the point of view affect the structure of the work? Integrated thesis. How does the point of view affect the tone of the work? Integrated thesis. What is the effect of the point of view? Integrated thesis. Does the point of view change in the work? Dynamic thesis. What is the purpose of the change in point of view? Integrated thesis. Tone. What is the tone of the work? Static thesis. How is the tone conveyed? Integrated thesis. How does the tone affect the main idea of the work? Integrated thesis. How does the tone change in course of the work? Dynamic thesis. What is the reason for the change in tone? Integrated thesis. Following an example of the pre-writing exercise which is used to find a thesis according to the steps on page 145. This exercise is on snake, which is in the appendix. You might recognize the free-writing exercise from chapter 2. Snake, Garden of Eden, symbol of evil, tempted Eve and Adam. Disappeared mysteriously into the bowels of the earth. Devil, king, graceful, not caring, does not bother the man, notices him and doesn't hurry. Man is sorry for throwing logs, stupid and cowardly. Snake is proud, beautiful, gold, poisonous, not brown, but not innocent either. Edna Volcano smoking reminds of hell, but the snake is not totally evil, natural, like cattle needing water to sip. Narrator hears voices of education telling him to kill the snake, doesn't know how to react. Misses snake when it's gone, but he gets mad that it starts to leave. He wants to keep it around for some reason, says it's a king in exile, a lord of life. Why should a snake be a lord? Maybe in the underworld. Maybe the man wants to see what the underworld is like, an animal's and the man's territory. The snake is an invader, but the man makes it into some kind of symbol, but not the old simple symbol of evil in the Bible. Something more. The writer notices 3 possible topics in this free writing exercise. The symbolism and characteristics of the snake, the narrator's reaction to the snake, the setting. The following questions are formulated from the topics and the list given on pages 146 and 147. What does the snake symbolize? Why does the narrator react as he does to the snake? What is the purpose of the setting? Looking back at the poem in the free writing paragraphs, the writer answers the questions in order. The snake is part evil, part natural animal, part king. The narrator is afraid of the snake. Snake seems to be in control, yet narrator is attracted by snake's grace and beauty. The narrator is cowardly and petty. The setting, especially the volcano and the underworld images, seems to add to the snake's evil character and power. The writer formulates 3 possible thesis statements. Others might have also evolved from these responses. 1. The narrator's reaction to the snake shows it to be both detestable and admirable, a symbol of evil, power, and beauty. 2. The narrator compared to the snake is cowardly and petty. 3. The images of the underworld and the volcano make the snake seem hellish, powerful, and mysterious. The answer to the initial questions may need a little refining before they can serve as a thesis upon which to base a rough draft.